Today, I'm going to be telling you story after story after story of wilderness adventure gone wrong. I've hiked thousands of miles over the years, and so believe me when I tell you that on rare occasions, fun backcountry dreams, well, they can turn into total nightmares. Some people disappear in the woods. Others take gambles that quickly turn fatal. And in one story that you're going to hear shortly, a man used the wilderness to hide himself while he preyed on a community for nearly 30 years. Folks, all of these stories are just insane. I think you're going to be quite entertained. And so with that said, let's dive headfirst into the world of outdoor mysteries. Hit that subscribe button to help us get to our goal of 1 million subscribers. And folks, buckle the heck up because here we go. The only thing more frightening than being attacked by a bear is being attacked by that very same bear 2 different times in a row. Just after sunrise on a cold October morning, Todd Orr made his way up a hiking trail in the mountains of Montana. This was a scenario that he had been in countless times before. Todd felt completely comfortable solo hiking through the wilderness. He had all the right gear to keep him safe, including a 10mm 911 pistol and an 8-ounce can of bear spray. Todd had hiked a few miles when all of a sudden he saw something that would scare the absolute shit out of pretty much all of us. About 80 yards off in the distance, Todd spotted a 400-pound grizzly bear, and this bear just so happened to be a mama with her cubs right by her side. Now, I can't imagine that Todd took pleasure in seeing this bear, but I tend to believe that he probably wasn't as scared as most people would be, as you or myself would be. And the reason I say that is because Todd was born and raised in the mountains of Montana, and he had spent the past 25 years working for the United States Forest Service. He had seen countless other bears in the wild over the course of his life, and besides, on the tiny chance that something did go wrong, once again, he had that gun and he had that bear spray to protect him. He had 2 defensive weapons, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, folks, everything went wrong for Todd Orr. This initial bear sighting would quickly turn into the bear charging Todd and Todd deploying his bear spray. And when this bear was confronted with a thick cloud of pepper mist, well, the bear charged right through it and it slammed right into Todd. The next series of events that would follow this are a mix of just frightening and miraculous and violent. And when all was said and done, folks, this was probably one of the most infamous bear attacks of all time. It went super viral, and I feel very honored today to tell you the story of Todd Orr. So I get asked all the time if telling all of these outdoor mystery stories on my channel makes me more scared to go hiking. And the honest truth is that it doesn't. I'm not scared of getting lost. I'm not scared of running into a murderer out on trail. And I'm not scared of dying in a freak accident. I am, however, very scared of grizzly bears and mountain lions, and I'm not afraid to admit it. And those of you that are regular viewers of this channel may have noticed that I've covered nearly every type of outdoor mystery on the channel at this point, with the exception of animal attacks. I've pretty much straight up avoided making videos about animal attacks because they're like the one thing that scares me the most when it comes to spending time in the wilderness. Now, I've never seen a grizzly bear or a mountain lion, let alone had a bad experience with one of them, but they're just so primally terrifying to me that I've basically refused to tell any stories about their attacks until now. It's time to confront this fear, and what better way to do it than to tell the story of the man, the myth, the legend himself, Todd Orr. So things are obviously about to get quite disturbing, and so before we get there, I wanna just relax for a second and tell you about Surfshark, who quite frankly are making it possible for us to bring you 3+ hours of content in the first place. Surfshark is a VPN, and I can already see your eyes glazing over when I said that because I'm sure you've heard 1,000 VPN ads just this week. And so give me a minute to tell you why Surfshark is the best VPN, why they're a little bit different. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, the name Surfshark is the best name for a VPN. I mean, that should be enough right there, but it's probably not. So, okay, jokes aside, Surfshark allows you to browse the web safely by adding an extra layer of security when you're using public Wi-Fi networks, which is something we all do so often these days, especially if you travel, you're staying at hotels and stuff like that. So data on public Wi-Fi usually isn't encrypted, and this can leave things like, I don't know, your credit card info, your passwords, or any other personal data at risk of being intercepted. Surfshark will encrypt your data and hide your IP address, and this keeps your information safe and it keeps it private, even when you're on the go and using public Wi-Fi. But Surfshark doesn't just stop there. They also have this thing called the Clean Web feature, which allows you to browse the internet without dealing with ads or things like trackers, malware, or even phishing attempts. But most importantly, those ads, which is kind of ironic given I'm doing an ad right now. Once again, I know you've heard 1,000 VPN ads, but folks, Surfshark is truly the one that you want to go with. It's been a total game changer for me when it comes to using the internet. And so if you want to secure your online activity, go to surfshark.com/KHH or scan the QR code on the screen right now. And when you do that, you're going to get an extra 4 months for free on your subscription. You can also click the link at the top of the description. Surfshark has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you literally have nothing to lose. There's no reason not to try it. So one more time, surfshark.com/KHH. Scan that QR code or click the link in the description and the thing down there. You're gonna get an extra 4 months for free on your subscription. And now let's get back to the story. You'd genuinely be hard-pressed to find anybody more experienced in the outdoors than Todd Orr. He grew up just a bit outside of Yellowstone National Park in a small town called Ennis, Montana, which is surrounded by wilderness on all sides. Todd spent his childhood exploring pretty much every outdoor pursuit, including hiking, snowboarding, fishing, and including hunting. When it comes to hunting in particular, well, this is an area where Todd really excelled from a very young age, and an area that would eventually lead him to earn a degree in fish and wildlife management from Montana State University. This, in turn, led to a career with the United States Forest Service, where Todd worked as a trail construction engineer in Custer-Gallatin National Forest, which was a job that required him to be outside in the wilderness almost every single day. And usually by himself, by the way. However, this never fazed Todd. In fact, he felt so comfortable alone in the wilderness completely by himself that he actually started a little side hustle selling handcrafted custom knives to hunters and other outdoor recreationists alike. This is just a little side note, but his company is called Skyblade Knives, and I will have a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. On the morning of October 1st, 2016, Todd Orr set out on a solo elk scouting mission. Now, rifle season was still a few weeks away, and Todd knew that his best chance to actually lay his eyes on an elk would be just after the sun came up. He planned to spend most of that day on trail. He was going to take photos, he was going to make notes about animal tracks and scat that he saw, and by the time that he returned to his truck, he hoped to know whether or not it would be worth hunting in the area once rifle season had begun. Todd pulls up and he parks his truck at the empty North Fork Bear Creek trailhead, and then he just set off into the woods. He followed the trail just like he had done hundreds and hundreds of times before. And just like all of those hundreds of previous times, he carried weapons with him as he made his way down the trail. He carried both a 10mm 1911 pistol and he carried an 8-ounce can of bear spray. Now, you might be wondering why Todd would even bother carrying the bear spray if he was already carrying a firearm. And that's a great question. And the answer is that Todd was experienced, well-practiced, and well-studied when it came to bear spray. Now, what I'm going to say next is a little bit controversial and definitely still up for debate, but there is research out there suggesting that bear spray is actually more effective against an aggressive bear than a firearm is. Through his passion for hunting and through his work, Todd was experienced with both firearms and bear spray, and he personally believed that bear spray was worth carrying and using in case of a bear attack. But honestly, none of that really would have mattered when Todd first set out on this hike. Of course, he wasn't thinking that he would ever be attacked by a bear. Nobody does. In fact, I would be willing to bet that this thought of an attack didn't even cross his mind when he literally spotted a mama grizzly bear with cubs about 80 yards in front of him. And the reason I say that is because while that is a unnerving circumstance, to put it mildly, it's one that Todd had been in countless times before. And on each and every one of those previous occasions, the bear simply ran away. That's it. That's what bears are supposed to do when they smell or they see a human. That's what they're supposed to do, and that's what they actually do in almost every single circumstance. In fact, that's actually what happened initially this time as well. The bear and her cubs, well, they stared at Todd for a moment, and then they went screaming over the ridge, and they ran out of sight. And so at this point, Todd figured that he wouldn't be seeing those bears ever again. But unfortunately, Todd would see those bears again. And he would actually see them 2 more times, to be exact. Todd Orr was about to find himself in the type of situation that's so rare, so statistically improbable, that it almost doesn't even seem real. So, after seeing the bears run away, Todd waited patiently for a few tense moments, but then he decided that the coast was clear and that he was safe to continue. And besides, the trail he was about to take would actually move him in the opposite direction from where the bears ran away to. And so he takes a deep breath, and then he takes a step forward. Then he takes another step. Then he takes another step, and then another step. He repeats this process no more than 12 times when all of a sudden he hears a noise coming from behind him. Todd turned to look over his left shoulder when he heard this noise, and when he did this, he realized that the very same 400-pound grizzly bear that he had just seen a few moments earlier was now charging directly at him. And folks, these bears can move quick. They can run up to 35 miles per hour. And just think about that. That's enough to get like a speeding ticket in a school zone. So both Todd's training and the speed at which the bear was charging told him that he only had a few seconds to react, a few seconds to save his life. And his first instinctual reaction was that, honestly, this bear was probably bluff charging. Bluff charges are way more common than an actual attack. And so he has this feeling, and then his next instinctual reaction was to grab his bear spray. This is the thing that everyone's gonna debate, like, oh, maybe he should have grabbed his gun. And if you want to do that, then fine. But that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to tell you what happened. Todd unholstered the can of bear spray. He removed the safety clip, and then he pointed it right at the bear. Todd had even tested this particular can of bear spray only a few weeks prior. And also, due to his job, he had taken numerous bear safety and bear spray classes over the years. And as if that wasn't enough, he had even used bear spray on a charging black bear once earlier in his career. And the reason I'm telling you all of this stuff is to say that if anyone knew how to effectively use bear spray, it was obviously Todd Orr. Within just a few milliseconds, well, Todd realized that this bear actually wasn't bluff charging. She was running full speed ahead, and she left Todd with no other option but to deploy his last line of defense. He unloaded his can of bear spray, putting a thick cloud of orange peppery mist between him and the bear. Now, this mist is supposed to irritate the nose and the throat of the bear, as well as just scare it and cause it to run away. And according to studies that have been done on bear spray, that's exactly what it does 98% of the time. Todd Orr would unfortunately be part of the 2% of circumstances where bear spray doesn't deter the bear. This bear was running so fast, and it was so determined to dominate Todd that it ran right through the cloud of pepper spray and it smashed right into Todd. Todd shoved his face into the dirt and he put his hands around the back of his neck. He was basically helpless at this point. The best thing that he could do was just try to protect his vital organs and honestly just lay there and take it. He began to feel the bear tearing away at the muscle in his shoulders, his back, and his arms. But then, after only about a split second and 6 bites, the bear began coughing and it ran away. Maybe the bear spray had actually worked after all. The bear had been charging too hard for the spray to stop the initial pounce. But after only a second or two, it appears that the spray caught up to the bear, irritating it to the point where, like, mid-attack, well, it gave up on Todd and it ran out of sight. So Todd just laid there for a second or two, but then he slowly picked himself up to take stock of his injuries. Now, he was bleeding quite a bit, but he could stand and he could walk. He assessed his condition and he realized that while he was certainly seriously injured and he needed to go to the hospital, none of his wounds, none of his injuries were life-threatening. He was all but assured to survive as long as he could make it back to his truck. Once he arrived there, the hard part would be over and he would just have to drive straight to the hospital and he would let the doctors handle it from there. But I repeat myself, that was all predicated on Todd making it back to his truck successfully. He was about 3 miles from the trailhead when he was attacked, and so he knew that his journey back to the truck would be by far the most important 3 miles that he had ever hiked in his life. Still bleeding quite a bit and holding his bear spray at the ready, mind you, Todd got moving. The first number of steps that he took were extremely nerve-wracking. I mean, he knew the bear was still in his general vicinity, even if it had ran away after it felt the effects of the bear spray. And because of these nerves, well, Todd quickly worked up to a very fast hiking pace, and he managed to travel about a half mile. And after making it this far, somehow his nerves actually subsided almost entirely. He no longer feared that the bear would come back for him, and it just so happened that his adrenaline was kind of wearing off now as well. I can only imagine that this came with the price of increased pain from his wounds, but regardless, Todd wouldn't have much time to think about this. He wouldn't have much time to feel this pain, because just when things were starting to look up, well, he heard a branch crack behind him. He turned around to see the very same grizzly bear charging at him once again, except this time the bear was so close to him that he had literally no time to react. He had no time to grab his pistol, no time to even deploy his bear spray. The bear slammed into Todd, knocking him 10 feet forward, and then she began mauling him for a second time. This time was a little different though. And the reason I say that is because, frankly, it was a lot worse. Her level of anger and her level of violence was turned up to a whole nother level. The bear pinned Todd down, and once again, he drew his hands in like this to kind of protect his neck and protect his head. The bear began biting his shoulders and his arms, and then it bit into his forearm so hard that he could literally feel his bone being crushed. When this happened, very understandably so, he reacted in pain. He moaned, he shouted out, and he moved around a little bit. And this movement and the noises that he made seemed to only further enrage the bear, which is obviously not good, but it also was good, because this is the moment that Todd realized an incredibly painful yet life-saving lesson. He realized that his only chance of survival was to essentially play dead. He had no choice but to just lay there and take the mauling while staying as perfectly still as he possibly could. The longer that he moved and reacted, the longer that he showed any signs of life at all, well, the longer that the attack would continue. In order to cope with this reality, well, Todd convinced himself that the attack would end soon because the mama bear would eventually need to go check on her cubs, right? He figured that he just needed to stay there, stay still for just a few more seconds before the bear would wander off. It would be gone. But unfortunately, well, little did he know, he still had a lot more pain to endure. The bear continued mauling him. It would open a gash on his head that would end up bleeding so bad that it basically blinded him. The bear was literally picking him up and then slamming him back down on the ground. Folks, the violence continued and continued until suddenly the bear stopped and it just kind of stood there on top of Todd. Todd held his breath and he just remained motionless as he actually felt the bear's breath on the back of his neck, which is very, very disturbing, a feeling I'm sure he won't ever forget. The bear stood there crushing him for roughly 30 seconds, and then the bear wandered off. It left. This was obviously a huge relief for Todd, but at the same time, he had no idea where the bear went. He just didn't know, right? Like, did the bear leave the scene for good? Did it run away? Or was it just kind of waiting off in the distance, ready to attack a third time and ready to deliver that final blow? Todd's thinking about this, and he just laid there, remaining motionless on the ground for close to a minute, but then he finally decided it was time to move. He mustered up the courage, he got up, and he looked around. His brain immediately went into defense mode, and so he thought about his gun. He stood up and he realized that his pistol had actually been tossed from his chest holder during the attack, and so he went over to it, he picked it up, and he cocked the hammer, and then he kind of just stood there and inspected his immediate surroundings, obviously looking for the bear. And much to his relief, well, he couldn't see the bear. She was still nowhere to be found. And so Todd grabbed the rest of his gear, including the bear spray, of course. And once again, he began moving down the trail towards his car. After he started moving, he had a second to kind of process what had happened. And he was in complete disbelief that he had been attacked not once, but twice, and had somehow survived both attacks. During this second getaway, Todd hiked at a slower pace as he made his way down the trail, and the reason that he did this is because he wanted to keep his heart rate as low as possible in order to limit bleeding. He had also once again made the decision that his best chance of survival came with reaching his truck as soon as possible, rather than spending precious time attempting to treat his wounds on the spot. And by the way, his wounds were much worse after this second attack than they were after the first attack. His left arm was rendered completely useless, and he actually kept it tucked in against his body while he was hiking out in order to prevent further injury and to minimize pain. He also tucked his pistol in with his damaged arm, and then he held his bear spray in his other arm while he was hiking out. And speaking of hiking out, it took him about 45 minutes, which is pretty impressive given the circumstances. For 45 minutes, he stumbled down the trail, stopping only twice to briefly assess his bleeding. By some miracle, folks, he reached his truck. And this was the moment, for the first time since the second attack, that Todd knew with 100% certainty that he was going to survive. He had done the hard work. All he needed to do now was to drive himself to the hospital. That was the most important thing, but Todd decided to add 2 bonus steps before he hit the road. The first thing that he did after he reached the trailhead was to actually try and warn other people about the dangerous bear. And I think this is a perfect illustration of Todd's character. I mean, he was literally bleeding, and by now I'm sure the adrenaline had worn off and he was in severe pain. He really needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible, but he still paused for a moment, pulled out a notepad from his truck, and attempted to write a warning note so that he could put it at the trailhead to warn other people about the bear. Unfortunately, despite his intentions here, he actually had to give up this idea because he was trying to write the note and his arms and his body was so damaged, and he was also dripping with so much blood that, well, the note was just completely illegible. And so eventually he gave up and he moved on to something else. Todd figured that some of his hunting buddies might appreciate it, so he actually began taking selfies of his current condition. He's standing there covered in blood and he's taking photos of himself. And then he actually took a video. He made like a quick clip just kind of recounting his brush with death, his brush with this grizzly bear. And later on, that very same video would end up on Facebook and would end up going completely viral. I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen this video. I remember seeing it way back at the time when this happened, way before I had a YouTube channel, way before I was thinking about covering stories like this. And unfortunately, I can't actually play anything from his viral video because, well, frankly, it's way too graphic and it would get this video banned immediately. But if you really want to find it, and I highly advise some discretion if you do because it's very graphic, but if you really want to find it and you look hard enough on Google, you're going to be able to find it. But anyways, Todd finished filming this video and then he got into his truck. He drove himself 30 minutes to the nearest emergency room, stopping only once to ask a local rancher to alert the hospital that he was on the way. And just another side note, can you imagine being that rancher? Like, can you imagine a guy pulling up in a pickup truck covered in blood and just being like, hey, do you mind calling the hospital and telling them that I'm on my way? I got attacked by a bear. Like, can you imagine? Just insane. When Todd arrived at the emergency room, his pain and his injuries literally prevented him from doing simple things like being able to put his truck in park and unbuckle his seatbelt. That's how bad his injuries were. I mean, the muscles and the tendons in both of his arms were badly damaged, and he had puncture wounds all over his upper body. He laid there in the hospital for nearly 8 hours as doctors stitched him up, and then he went home. He got a few hours of rest, and then he returned the next morning for a series of surgeries. 2 of Todd's tendons in his left forearm had been completely torn. He also had extensive nerve damage, he had broken bones, and of course, he had muscle damage. His road to recovery would be very, very long, but within 6 weeks of the attack, Todd was healthy and mobile enough to actually go hiking again. And as I'm sure you can maybe imagine, the trail that he chose to go hiking on this time was the very same trail that he had nearly died on. That's right, folks. He went back to the attack sites only 6 weeks after the attack. This time he brought along a friend and he went back to try and face his fears. And I'm happy to report that, well, it must have worked, because within just a few more months, Todd was back at work surveying trails for the Forest Service, often, once again, in the wilderness, completely by himself. He would go on to make a near full recovery from the attack. I mean, he's basically back to normal with only a few lingering effects in his left hand and his left forearm. I actually had the great pleasure of speaking with Todd in preparation for this video, and one thing that I was really curious about was why his bear spray didn't stop the bear during that first attack. I'm sure this is something that a lot of you are wondering about as well, and so allow me to read you his response. Quote, "The bear was in a full charge at 35 or 40 miles per hour and didn't slow at all when she got close. So she blasted through the cloud of spray in a fraction of a second, and it took a few seconds before it got to her sinuses and began irritating her. She bit me a half dozen times and then started coughing from the spray and took off. So it definitely worked and deterred her, just a few second delay due to the speed of the attack. Most bears would bluff charge and stop short. That's where they get a full blast of spray and usually turn around and run." It's also worth mentioning that Todd wrote an entire blog post about why the bear spray didn't stop his attacks, and so I'll link it below, and I highly recommend that you read through it before you start commenting on the effectiveness of firearms versus bear spray when it comes to bear attacks like this. I would also highly recommend that you go check out Todd's company, Skyblade Knives. Now, this isn't sponsored, and he's not paying me to say this, but I will say that these knives look super, super cool. I think they'd make like a great present for your loved one who likes to hunt or likes the outdoors. And, well, frankly, Todd was nice enough to let me cover his story without asking for anything in return, and so I figured that giving his company a shout out was the least that I could do. Once again, the link to his knife company is also in the description. Folks, Todd Orr is a certified badass. I'm so thankful that he survived, and I'd encourage you to please show him some love in the comment section right now. On November 21st, 2020, the BBC published an article about an adventurous couple who had spent 6 years traveling around Europe in a camper van. And then the very next day, the woman highlighted in this article vanished off the face of the earth. Esther Dingley had set off on a solo backpacking trip in the Pyrenees Mountains, which was a feat that was well within her abilities. She was an extremely experienced hiker, which made it all the more suspicious when she didn't return home from her trek. As the search for Esther ramped up, theories began bouncing around on the internet. Did she have an accident on the mountain, or did she simply run away to start a new life? Was it possible that maybe foul play was involved? All of these theories were looked into, and investigators even used her last photo, which was taken just moments before she disappeared, to try and search for clues in the reflection of her sunglasses. They searched and searched, but eventually winter set in, and the search had to be called off. No sign of Esther had been found, and at this point it seemed like everyone, the media and those closest to Esther included, believed that foul play was the culprit behind her disappearance. Some seedy journalists even speculated that her partner Dan Colgate himself may have been involved. Months went by, and as the case received more and more attention, the theories continued to stack up. But then, Dan Colgate made a discovery that would go on to serve as a case study for why wild speculation, theories, and internet guesswork should always be taken with a massive grain of salt. This is the wild story of Esther Dingley, her disappearance and death, and the media storm that surrounded it. Folks, this is an incredibly fascinating and, of course, an incredibly sad story. There's no happy ending in this one, I'm just going to tell you that right up front, but there is some closure. However, back to the fascinating thing actually, what makes this story so fascinating to me is that multiple theories were put forth by the authorities, the media, and even Esther's partner himself. Yet when the case was actually solved, it turned out that none of these theories were actually true, and rather the most obvious, for lack of a better word, reason for Esther's disappearance was, in fact, true. I think it's a good lesson in human nature. Sometimes, well, we seek out the most dramatic and story-worthy explanations, and in the process, well, we overlook the most realistic explanations. So with that said, let's go on a virtual trip to the Pyrenees Mountains of France and Spain. I've heard it's absolutely beautiful there. I have a friend who traveled there recently, and I'm going to take you all there right now for free. But all you have to do is hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. We're almost at 500,000 subscribers, which is insane. And so if you've been enjoying my videos, I'd really appreciate your help getting us there. In 2002, Esther Dingley and Dan Colgate met each other while they were attending Oxford University. They bonded over their shared interests in fitness, in outdoor pursuits, and in traveling, and this bond quickly turned into a relationship, a very long one at that. Flash forward to the beginning of 2014, and the couple was set to get married. Everything about their lives looked pretty perfect on the surface, but little did anybody know, everything in Dan and Esther's world was about to get turned upside down. The next chapter of Dan and Esther's life was incredibly difficult, to put it mildly. In February of 2014, only 3 weeks before the scheduled wedding for Esther Dingley and Dan Colgate, well, Dan Colgate came within inches of losing his life in a very awful fashion, by the way. Dan contracted an extremely rare and life-threatening infection, and I don't even know how to pronounce this. Levi will put it on the screen right now, but I've seen it described as a flesh-eating disease. So, yeah, not very good, to put it mildly. Dan's condition was so serious that doctors even told Esther to, like, say her final goodbyes to Dan, just in case he didn't make it, which is just insane, and I can't imagine being put in that situation. Thankfully, though, Dan did make it. He survived. And once he started recovering, the couple reportedly transformed their relationship. Esther was quoted saying, "We really loved to travel, and we kept saying one day we would do it, but there was always another project, another job. We were always just chasing the next objective. Then, all of a sudden, someone turns around and says the person I love and was planning to do it all with could be gone by the morning." And so, within the first few weeks of Dan's recovery, the couple made a very bold move, one that countless other couples and individuals, for that matter, dream about but don't actually do. The couple sold their car, they rented out their apartment, and they moved into a camper van. The plan was to spend the next year living on the road, exploring the beauty that Europe has to offer. And the icing on the cake was that once Dan was fully recovered, the couple hoped that the flexibility and the freedom of this new lifestyle would allow them to spend as much time as they wanted doing their two favorite things, which were cycling and hiking mountains. This hope would actually end up turning into their reality, and it seemed as though the couple was having so much fun in their adventures that their 1-year travel plans turned into 2 years, which then turned into 3 years. And before they knew it, well, folks, it turned into six full years. Esther and Dan started a blog to share their experiences with the world. They worked odd jobs here and there to avoid completely draining their savings, and they gradually got rid of all of their possessions that didn't fit inside the camper van. In 2017, they adopted a stray dog, and then they quickly found out that that dog was pregnant, and so just like that, boom, now they have 5 dogs living with them in the camper van, which was an unexpected turn of events that would actually go on to serve as the inspiration behind their children's book. The book was titled Puppy Pack Adventures, which was published in October of 2020. And I know that Dan Colgate also published a number of other books, and they were just doing it all, folks. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the year 2020, I think we all remember the craziness that ensued that year. I mean, lives were lost, livelihoods were lost, and the entire world was basically just thrown into chaos. And of course, this chaos ended, or at the very least challenged, many personal relationships for all of us. And of course, Esther and Dan, well, they weren't immune to this. Now, to be clear, the couple did not break up during the COVID pandemic, but they did take it as an opportunity to spend some time apart, still in a relationship, just in different physical locations. Esther was quoted saying, "We realized during the coronavirus we had not been apart from each other for a year, so we decided to each just do our own thing for a bit. This whole thing has been really good for us individually and our relationship. We are genuinely happy now." Esther and Dan spent at least 80 days hiking together from July 17th through October 4th, completing a 1,000 plus mile hike through the Alps. This is a side note, but I think this should illustrate just how experienced and skilled Esther was in the outdoors. And it should also come as no surprise that she felt comfortable hiking in the mountains by herself as well. So back to their relationship, Esther and Dan made that decision to spend some time apart shortly after finishing this long hike. And thus, Esther set out in the camper van by herself, and she spent the next few weeks exploring the Pyrenees Mountains along the French and Spanish border, heading out into the wilderness for like a few days at a time, and then returning back to the van. When France introduced some very strict stay-at-home orders due to the coronavirus pandemic again, well, Esther decided to head across the border into Spain, eventually arriving in the town of Benasque. By the way, folks, this is the point in the story where we start to get to a lot of Spanish and French words of places and mountains and stuff. And as my regular viewers know, I am terrible at pronouncing even English words, and so please bear with me while I try to pronounce these French and Spanish words. It's not going to be pretty, but I apologize. After spending a few days trail running and backpacking near Benasque, Esther set out on one last hike before she planned to return to France. The date was November 21st, 2020, and she took supplies for a 4 to 5 day backpacking trip, planning to summit a mountain called, here we go, Pic de Sauvegarde. This also just so happened to be the day that the BBC published their article highlighting Dan and Esther's nomadic lifestyle. Esther planned to return from her hike on November 25th, but unfortunately, she never made it back to town. However, unlike many missing hiker cases where someone is never heard from again after they start their hike, Esther had communicated quite frequently with Dan during the first 2 days of her adventure. So the same day that she hiked out, that is November 21st, once again, Esther sent numerous texts to Dan throughout the day, including when she reached the summit of the mountain. And while she was on top of this mountain, she wrote a message to Dan that said, quote, "Love you so much, XXX. Thank you for encouraging me and giving me this confidence. Really appreciated all the messages to get me on my way this morning." It then appears that Esther descended the mountain and, well, she lost cell phone service. However, Dan heard from her again the next day when she actually climbed back up to the summit. It was here that the couple exchanged a series of texts, they had a quick video chat, and Esther confirmed that she had spent the night at a remote mountain hut called Cabana de la Becertas. This is also the point in our story where Esther sent Dan this selfie. It shows her smiling wide in the midst of doing what she loved the most, which was climbing mountains and spending time immersed in remote nature. There's absolutely nothing unusual, let alone disturbing, about this photo, except for the fact that it would go on to be the last photo ever taken of Esther Dingley. After sending Dan the selfie, they exchanged a few more text messages, with Esther's last message indicating that she would be heading down the mountain on the French side of the border. She wrote, quote, "Tomorrow heading for Port de la Glaire," or something spelt like that. "Might dip into France. Hoping Refuge Benasque has a winter room. Keep you posted when can. Love you, XX." November 23rd and November 24th, both these days went by and nobody, including Dan, received any messages from Esther. But this wasn't exactly cause for concern, because while she was very good about communicating her status while on solo adventures, Dan and Esther's family knew that cell service was very unreliable in the mountains. However, nobody heard from Esther on November 25th either. Again, this was supposed to be the day that she returned from her hike, and so by the end of the day, Dan Colgate made the very difficult decision to report her missing. Now, because Esther was hiking on and around the French-Spanish border, agencies from both countries set out searching for her literally first thing in the morning on November 26th. And I imagine that many of the searchers figured they would find her pretty quickly. And I say that because A, she was an incredibly experienced hiker and she knew how to handle herself in an unexpected emergency, and B, because, well, the searchers were about to go, pardon my language here, the searchers were about to go hard as f***. I really mean that, folks. They were on the ground at sunrise the morning after Esther was reported missing, and they threw everything they had at this search. They used dogs, they used helicopters, they used a magnitude of professional, highly trained searchers that knew those specific mountains like the back of their hand. The Spanish teams even used high-powered telescopes to scan the area around where she was last known to have been. Searchers spared zero effort, even spending time looking underneath rocks and climbing down into crevasses in case Esther had become trapped in one. I know that they used drones as well, and in addition to this massive effort, the search for Esther Dingley had another asset working for it, and that was Dan Colgate himself. Nobody knew Esther and her habits in the outdoors as well as Dan did. And so while the search for Esther commenced, well, Dan began hiking around the terrain near her last known location by himself, searching for her, even continuing into the night on many occasions outside of the normal search and rescue hours. This massive effort to locate Esther lasted for 6 entire days. But then, on December 2nd, winter finally reared its ugly head, and the area around the mountain that she was missing from received a massive dumping of snow. And because of this, the search unfortunately stalled, and soon after, well, it was halted indefinitely. And folks, by this point, many questions were being asked about what the hell had happened to Esther. These questions were largely due to the fact that she had not been found despite such a massive and thorough search, and these questions only increased as the story began to make international headlines. I really hate to say this, but Esther's disappearance really made for catchy articles and headlines. You've got this attractive, outdoorsy couple living this dreamy nomadic lifestyle, and then all of a sudden something goes horribly wrong, and well, mystery ensues. I think you can probably understand what I mean here. That particular storyline was certain to capture the public's attention, and well, that's exactly what happened. Throw in some public speculation from the police and also from Dan himself, and well, you've got yourself a viral story. The first theory that the media seemed to really grab onto was the theory that Esther disappeared willingly in order to start a new life or to possibly flee her relationship with Dan. Here's what I mean. I think this headline from the Daily Mail sums this speculation up pretty well. One of the leaders of the French part of the investigation into the disappearance is quoted numerous times throughout this article, and in these quotes, he suggests that there may have been trouble in Esther and Dan's relationship. This investigator said, quote, "It does not seem probable that Esther suffered an accident, and it is not credible that she was eaten by a bear or that she has fallen into a lake. We believe that her disappearance is either the result of a voluntary act or as a result of someone else's actions. We went to see Mr. Colgate so that we could go through social media with him, messages, etc." And then the investigator dropped the bombshell line that journalists all over the world took advantage of. He said, quote, "It appears that their lives together were not as happy as the images posted on social media suggest." Now, this investigator did stress that Dan Colgate was not a suspect in Esther's disappearance, but this didn't stop the media from painting a less than ideal picture of the couple's relationship. I read a lot of speculation about how the couple might have been kind of butting heads over their nomadic lifestyle that I've mentioned a few times here, about how Esther wanted to keep traveling in the van and Dan maybe was ready to settle down a little bit more. The media even got their hands on some CCTV footage of Esther in a supermarket just a few days before her disappearance. And of course, the media used this footage to further the narrative that Esther was in a bad mental state at the time. The footage shows Esther being confused about the price of some chia seeds. She was in Spain after all, and she was not fluent in Spanish, that's my understanding. Then another customer in the store helped translate for her, and this customer was later interviewed and described Esther as looking sad and thoughtful. And let's be honest, this really isn't that much evidence of anything, right? I mean, it's just some low resolution footage of Esther shopping and one quote from a random lady who talked to her for literally just a few seconds. But unfortunately, that's all it took to further fuel the media speculation that Esther and Dan were in trouble in their relationship. And this theory was being speculated over so much that eventually Dan Colgate felt the need to respond personally. On February 2nd, 2021, he wrote on the couple's Facebook page, quote, "Regarding suggestions that Esther's disappearance was in some way voluntary, my response remains that she had neither the motive or the means to do so. She hasn't accessed any funds or been seen anywhere despite widespread press coverage. I am of course aware of the speculation in the media regarding our relationship, stoked by quotations from both police sources and people that met Esther during her time away. So far, I have been loath to even engage with such salacious nonsense, believing that it was nobody else's business. All I will say here is that the police officers actually investigating her disappearance have full access to our communications, which reflect the truth that our relationship is solid. Any comments to the contrary reflect a misunderstanding of that reality. But if Dan was outright dismissing speculation that the state of their relationship may have caused Esther to run away, well then, what was his explanation for her disappearance? And to be clear, he certainly didn't owe anyone an explanation for this, but this question is the question that many people were asking him. And it was a question that eventually he felt enough pressure to answer. In that very same Facebook post, Dan concluded that, quote, somebody else has been involved in Esther's disappearance and against her will. And I got to admit, his reasoning for this bold claim was pretty solid. Dan explained that the weather during Esther's disappearance was excellent. That was the exact word that he used, actually. And he also explained that Esther was very good about communicating her routes, her plans, and the type of terrain that she was hiking on. He also explained that cell phone signal in the area that she disappeared from was actually pretty solid, at least for mountain standards. It was much better than people had previously thought when she first disappeared. He also mentioned just how determined Esther was, and that he believed that if she had suffered an injury out there, she still would have made it out of the backcountry, or at least put herself in a position to be found by searchers. He wrote, quote, even if she had a broken leg, I have no doubt she would have still gotten down the mountain somehow, never mind take action to make shelter and become visible. In reference to Esther running off intentionally, Dan noted that despite all of the widespread media coverage that her story was getting, nobody had spotted or recognized her in public anywhere, and he also mentioned that she hadn't accessed her bank account. And of course, he also stressed that she was experienced enough to know that if she intentionally disappeared, it would launch a massive search for her. He wrote, quote, the idea that she would trigger that, again referring to the search effort, and put others at risk to get some time alone, rather than simply say, I need some time alone, is ridiculous to me. Dan then summed things up pretty well with this paragraph. Quote, the core fact is this. A happy, experienced, well-equipped, and fit young woman went missing in an area with clear paths and mostly open terrain. An intensive search found no sign of her or of any of her equipment. It is as though she vanished into thin air. All of the factors mentioned in this Facebook post are what led Dan to conclude that Esther may have been the victim of foul play. And of course, going back to the media, as eager as they were to keep this story in the headlines, they jumped on this statement from Dan and they plastered it everywhere. Dan also made a statement to the Daily Mirror that he had run into some hunters while he was out searching for Esther, and he speculated that maybe she had been killed by somebody who was armed in the mountains. Now, one thing that I think is important to note here is that despite his statements, Dan never dismissed the possibility that an accident could have happened. He did say that he felt it was highly unlikely, but he never said that he was like 100% sure that Esther had disappeared due to foul play. And his actions backed up this sentiment because he continued to search the mountain by himself on foot. And during the summer of 2021, additional organized searches were carried out as well. And then, on July 23rd, 2021, a trail runner discovered human bones right along the French-Spanish border in an area known as Port de la Glare. Glare? I can't say that word, folks, I'm sorry, but you'll recall that Esther had actually texted Dan about heading into this exact area right before she disappeared. DNA testing quickly commenced, and a week later, it was announced to the public that the bone that had been found, which was a skull bone, did in fact belong to Esther Dingley. So this was obviously a bombshell break in the case, but of course, the rest of Esther's remains were still missing, as was her gear and her clothing. The case was definitely now broken wide open, but it hadn't yet been solved. Dan Colgate, for his part, still determined to find his partner, continued his solo search efforts, and a few weeks later, they paid off, you could say, although in a very, very sad way. On August 9th, 2021, Dan Colgate himself found the rest of Esther Dingley's remains, as well as the equipment that she had been carrying when she disappeared. Let's just sit in that for a second. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me that the disappearance of Esther was solved by her own partner. I don't think I've ever covered a story where that's happened before. It's a testament to how hard Dan Colgate worked to get the closure that he and Esther's family so badly deserved. I even read in one article that he walked over 700 miles in 1 month just searching for Esther. The day after Dan made this discovery, it was announced to the media that Esther had been found. Police investigations quickly determined that her death was not due to foul play, and it was definitely not due to relationship issues, by the way. It was rather due to the one thing that everyone thought was impossible after such a thorough search had taken place. She had died because of a fall, aka an accident in the backcountry. Despite this, albeit tragic end, but still an end to the story of Esther Dingley's disappearance, the media was still determined to milk it for all that they could. Following his discovery of Esther's body, Dan Colgate met with the police to give a statement about what he had found. This seems like pretty standard procedure to me. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, if you find a dead body, obviously the police are gonna want to talk to you about what you found. For some journalists, not all of them, but some of them, well, they tried to reframe Dan's post-discovery interview with the police like this. Hiker Esther Dingley's boyfriend quizzed at length by cops after finding her body. I mean, that's just pretty scummy, isn't it? I mean, I feel so bad for Dan Colgate. In addition to the stress and the heartbreak of losing his life partner, also having to deal with the spotlight from the media like this, and to have to deal with journalists looking to take advantage of his situation and paint him in a bad light, well, I can't even imagine how tough that must have been. And so for that reason, I encourage all of you to go show Dan Colgate some love in the comments section. So we're never gonna know exactly what caused Esther Dingley to fall while she was hiking, but from all of the research I've done, it seems as though an accidental death is pretty much all but indisputable. The location of her body and the way that her gear was like scattered clearly indicated this fall, and her autopsy results supported it as well. And that actually brings me to an important point that I want to make, a point that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. When somebody goes missing, there's always going to be speculation. And I'm not even saying that there's anything wrong with speculation. I mean, it's important to discuss all different possible theories so that you can eventually get to the truth of what happened. However, this story is a pretty prime example of how even those closest to the case, those that are the most informed about what may have happened, those that are closest to the person that disappeared themselves, well, even these folks can sometimes be wrong. I don't say this to blame Dan Colgate for sharing his opinion that foul play was possible in Esther's disappearance. I don't blame him at all for coming to that conclusion. And honestly, based on the facts that he had available at the time, I think it was a very reasonable conclusion. And if I was in his shoes, I think I would have thought the same thing. Ultimately, though, the one theory that pretty much everyone had dismissed after the search was concluded, not just Dan, but the police as well, this is the theory that ended up being the true reason for Esther's disappearance. I hope that you keep that in mind next time you weigh the validity of speculation over missing persons cases. Speculation can definitely be useful sometimes. Again, don't get me wrong, I do plenty of it on this channel, but at the end of the day, it is just that. It's speculation and it's not fact. Before Esther's funeral, Dan Colgate started a GoFundMe to raise money for a charity that was, quote, close to Esther's heart. The charity is called Sight Savers, who work to cure preventable blindness. Now, Dan's GoFundMe has long since ended, but for my call out this week, I'd like to encourage you to make a small donation to Sight Savers. I figured it would be a good way to honor Esther. I've made a donation myself, and I'll have their page linked in the description. And I'm not affiliated with this charity in any way, but I don't know. I think it'd be a good way to honor Dan as well. My heart goes out to both of them, as well as their families. And I encourage you once again to show some love for Dan and Esther in the comments. In late March of 2020, a group of stubborn hikers approached Apache Peak on the Pacific Crest Trail. I say that these hikers were stubborn because at the exact moment that they were climbing this mountain, the world was in the process of shutting down due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so even though the government and the families of these hikers were literally begging them to get off the trail, well, they were still determined. After all, they had set out to hike the entire distance of the PCT from Mexico to Canada, and at this point, they were only a few weeks into their journey. There was no way that they were going to give up this early, despite all of the warnings and advisories and news coverage and fear-mongering. These hikers wouldn't have known it at the time, but as they climbed higher up the mountain, this virus, this pandemic, well, that would have been the last of their concerns. Something much more dangerous was on the horizon, and these hikers were about to walk straight into it. After a few miles of hiking, the trail suddenly disappeared. Mother Nature had dumped multiple feet of snow on the mountains, and this left the hikers with no choice but to traverse across a steep, icy slope with no trail to guide them. The first hiker in the group made it across successfully, but for the second hiker, 22-year-old Trevor Lauber, the results would be much different. I'm sure that Trevor was a bit nervous as he took his first steps across this slope, but he would have had no idea about the horror that was about to happen. You see, folks, what happened next was an event so terrifying and honestly so heart-wrenching that it would go on to impact the history of the Pacific Crest Trail forever. And so without further ado, folks, this is the story of Trevor Lauber. So I just said that this was Trevor's story. I mean, that's the best way to sum it up, I guess. But the truth is that this story goes much deeper than just him. It's also the story of his father, Doug. It's the story of the rest of Trevor's family. And it's the story of the Pacific Crest Trail community at large. And so, folks, this is a tough one to tell because I've frankly gotten to know Doug Lauber over the last few years, but we're going to do it. Let's take a virtual trip right now to the Pacific Crest Trail. This trip costs you nothing except a click of that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. I mean, you're going to help us reach our goal of 500,000 subscribers, which we are so close to. So please hit that subscribe button. Okay, let's go. In the spring of 2020, Trevor Lauber set out to accomplish a goal that he had held for literally years. That goal was to thru hike the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a footpath that runs border to border from Mexico all the way up to Canada. Now, those of you that are regular viewers of the channel, well, you probably already know about the PCT, and most of you probably know that I myself actually set out to hike the PCT back in 2022. The PCT is a total piece of cake. I mean, it's only 2,650 miles long, and that's sarcasm. As of right now, I've completed everything except for the northernmost 170 miles of it. I'm gonna finish it soon, but that's besides the point. Most people will take around 4 to 6 months to complete a thru hike like this, and so obviously a lot of sacrifices have to be made in order to make that happen. I mean, most people don't just find themselves with like 6 months of spare time in their hands, and so instead, prospective thru hikers have to plan far in advance so that their life can accommodate such a long journey. For a lot of people, myself included, this means quitting a job in order to go hike. And for other people, like Trevor Lauber, for instance, this means restructuring the entirety of your academic studies. So during his junior year of college at Ohio State, by the way, Trevor told his father, Doug, that he would be attempting to graduate a semester early so that he had time to go hike the PCT before he entered the job market. This meant that Trevor would be cramming extra classes into his final 3 semesters. And that is just absolutely insane to have that much extra course load. And it's even more impressive, by the way, when you consider that Trevor's major was computer science. Now, I'm probably a bit biased in saying this because I was also a computer science major, but then again, I guess that means I can tell you from firsthand experience that computer science is a tough major. The fact that Trevor had the confidence, the skills, and clearly the intelligence to take on all these extra classes in his final 3 semesters and graduate early is extremely impressive. There's no way that I could have done that. And I bet that when he made that decision and he committed to that decision, he probably knew that it was going to take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So when Trevor first told his parents about his intentions to go hike the PCT, they were understandably a little bit resistant. This is something that a lot of thru hikers go through. I mean, it's not always easy getting loved ones who aren't as familiar with the trail on board with the adventure. And for a few months, actually, Trevor's plans to hike the PCT created a lot of tension between him and his parents. However, they did eventually come around, and Trevor's father, Doug, actually began researching the trail and learning about the trail just as much as Trevor. Now, Doug wasn't going to hike the trail himself, but he was actually getting very excited to follow Trevor's journey. I mean, it really didn't take long at all before Doug had done a complete 180 in terms of Trevor's hike. I mean, not only was he now just supportive of it, but he wanted to be involved with it as much as he possibly could. And by the way, Doug definitely wasn't a long distance backpacker or a thru hiker, but he wasn't a stranger to backpacking either. And he had spent a lot of time day hiking and even overnighting backpacking camping with Trevor in the years leading up to 2020. This is important because Doug had been able to witness firsthand just how alive Trevor felt when he was in the wilderness. And Doug was proud. He was proud of Trevor for taking on such an ambitious goal. And yet another testament to how smart Trevor was, frankly, and how hard he worked, he was actually able to secure a job at Microsoft before he graduated. And so because of this job and this obligation, this meant that Trevor didn't really have time to hike the entire PCT. Instead, he had from mid-March to about mid-July to make it as far north on the trail as he could. I can only imagine that securing this job at Microsoft, which is just super impressive in and of itself, I can only imagine that put his parents at ease. I mean, knowing that their son had stable employment lined up for when he finished the hike, and Trevor would end up successfully graduating from college early. And then on March 9th, 2020, he traveled to Phoenix, Arizona with Doug, his father, and his sister, Olivia. Their plan was to spend some time there with some family members, I believe Trevor and Olivia's grandparents, before Doug and Olivia would fly back home to Texas. At that point, Trevor would then be driven to the southern terminus of the PCT by his grandparents, and after that, he would start hiking north. They landed in Phoenix, and then all of a sudden, this plan nearly unraveled. You'll recall that, mid-March of 2020 is exactly when the world began to change due to the coronavirus pandemic and government's response to it around the world. I mean, it was just absolutely exploding at this time. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. And so just before Doug and Olivia were set to fly back to Texas, Doug passively suggested that maybe Trevor should join them in going home and cancel his hiking plans altogether. Now, this is definitely not what Trevor wanted to hear, but you can kind of understand why Doug did this, right? I mean, I just said it there. There was so much unknown at this point. It was a very scary time. And so I hope that Trevor was able to at least appreciate where his father was coming from. But I guess regardless of whether or not he did, well, Trevor didn't listen to Doug. Trevor was still going to go hike the PCT, and Doug knew that convincing his son to give up on this, especially only a few days before he was going to start, was pretty much a losing argument entirely. And, well, he was right. Trevor had spent years dreaming of hiking the PCT. I mean, he had completely altered half of his college experience to make it happen. And, of course, he had been training intensely for months and months, getting his body ready for this. Nothing was going to stop Trevor from going out and accomplishing this goal. Though I will say, this was the first of many attempts that Doug would make to try to convince him not to do it. So Doug and Olivia fly back to Texas without Trevor, of course, and they do this on March 13th. Doug later wrote, quote, saying our final goodbyes at the airport, Trevor gave me a longer embrace than usual, much longer, in fact. And in that embrace, he whispered to me, I love you, Dad. Thanks for all you've done to help make this adventure a reality for me. And to that, Doug replied, quote, go hike the shit out of that trail. On March 16th, 2020, Trevor's grandparents dropped him off at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail, right on the Mexican border. This photo right here was taken at the very beginning of Trevor's hike while he was standing at that southern terminus. It's an awesome photo. There's tons of photos of other hikers like this out there. There's even one of me, frankly, when I started the PCT. And there's nothing, unusual about this photo per se. There's nothing disturbing until you learn what happened next. After this photo was taken, Trevor began his walk north. And for the first few days, things went basically according to plan. Now, a lot of you know this, but a lot of you probably don't. Contrary to what a lot of people think, a through hike like the Pacific Crest Trail is actually quite a social experience. It's like, yeah, you're in the wilderness, you're in the woods, but the truth is that thousands of people attempt the PCT every single year, and you end up seeing the same people day in and day out as you all kind of move north together. Because of this, Trevor was able to make some friends with other hikers, and he formed what many people call a trail family. It's essentially a crew of like-minded hikers moving up the trail together, camping together, and going into town to resupply together. So everything goes great on the first few days. Trevor's making these friends, but then on day 5, Trevor faced what would be the first real challenges of his hike. He actually faced two completely different challenges to be exact. It was on day 5 that Trevor and his trail family got caught in a very nasty late winter storm, and they became completely soaking wet in freezing cold temperatures, which is a very, very dangerous situation. They couldn't even find like a safe, protected area to set up camp, and so they essentially just had to suffer. They had to just tough it out. Thankfully, they ended up being okay. They did tough it out. This is something that every thru hiker goes through, and fortunately, nobody was harmed during this very humbling experience for the hikers. However, once Trevor managed to warm himself up, get safe, get comfortable again, and turn on his cell phone, well, he immediately fell into the second challenge of March 19th, 2020. You see, folks, it was on this very day that the Pacific Crest Trail Association, which is the organization that manages the PCT, well, they advised all hikers to avoid the trail due to the pandemic. They urged hikers who were planning on starting to cancel their trips, and they also urged hikers that were already on the trail to leave immediately. And at the very same time, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a stay-at-home order, and, well, it wasn't long before Doug was once again arguing for Trevor to come home, although this time he had much clearer justification and he was definitely a lot more determined to make it happen. Trevor, understandably so, still didn't want to leave the trail. His father argued that the PCT wasn't going anywhere. Trevor could always return the following year or another year sometime in the future. Doug argued that Trevor was actually being a little selfish in continuing to hike. He was putting locals in the towns along the PCT at risk. And he also argued that Trevor was being inconsiderate of his wishes and the wishes of his mother and his sister. Doug was so determined to get his son to come home from the PCT that he even considered cutting Trevor's finances off. However, all of this failed to persuade Trevor. It might have been a little easier to convince him if the stay-at-home order had been issued before he had actually started his hike, but he was already out there. He had already made friends at this point. He had already faced physical adversity in the mountains, and he had persevered. I mean, folks, Trevor was doing the damn thing. And until he was literally faced with legal repercussions for continuing to hike, he made it very clear that he was not gonna stop. And again, I can't really blame him. Trevor told Doug, quote, "This is my dream, Dad. I'm living it right now. The views, the vistas, the things I get to see are the most beautiful that I've ever seen in my life. If I lose this opportunity now, I'll lose it forever." Eventually, Doug and the rest of the Lauber family, well, they gave in. It was clear that Trevor was not going to come home, and so rather than waste any more energy trying to convince him to come home, they instead decided to use this energy to keep him safe and to support him. His father, Doug, and the rest of the Lauber family became Trevor's eyes and ears when it came to updates on COVID and updates on trail conditions. They would have a lot more time to spend researching and reading the news and stuff than Trevor would, because he was in the mountains hiking, and so the family would relay any new information that they found so that Trevor, could just focus on hiking safely without any distractions. The family would also send him boxes of food and supplies in town so that Trevor would continue to stay well equipped and, of course, well fed. And so Trevor and his trail family pressed on, and they actually very quickly crossed the first real milestone for PCT hikers, which is the 100-mile mark. Now, 100 miles is a drop in the bucket when you think of how long the entire PCT really is, but given everything that Trevor had gone through in those first 100 miles, I'm sure that it felt pretty damn good. However, at this point, one of the other hikers in Trevor's family, his name was Leo, well, Leo was not feeling very good. Leo had suffered a knee injury, which is a very common ailment at the beginning of a long hike like this. And so just after the 100-mile mark, Leo decided to take a few days off. He decided to head to a hotel and rest in order to hopefully let his body heal. And before he got a ride off the trail, he actually asked Trevor and the rest of his trail family if they wanted to join him. After all, in addition to just resting their bodies, it would have been a great opportunity for the hikers to kind of just take a deep breath and assess if it was a good idea to keep hiking during the growing pandemic. It would have been much easier to research all of this and to make this decision while you're sitting in a hotel room with Wi-Fi rather than when you're in the mountains out in the cold on your phone, barely having any service. But regardless of this, Trevor and the rest of his trail family turned Leo down. Leo later recalled Trevor telling him, quote, "We're just going to keep going till someone tries to stop us." And thus, Leo parted ways with Trevor and the rest of the group, unable to convince them to take the rest days with him. Leo would go on to spend a few days laying low in the hotel, watching TV, and more specifically, watching the news. And this opportunity to kind of reconnect with the outside world made Leo realize that continuing to hike against the wishes of the PCTA and against the wishes of the state of California was probably a bad idea. Leo would never make it back to the PCT after this. He left the trail and he went home. The main reason why I'm telling you this part of the story is because, well, one can only wonder what would have happened if Trevor and the rest of the group had joined Leo during those days off instead of continuing to hike. If that had happened, maybe Trevor would have finally realized the severity of the pandemic, and maybe he would have made the decision to go home. Or maybe he wouldn't have. But either way, if Trevor had gone into town with Leo, it's likely that I wouldn't be making this video for all of you right now. And I genuinely wish that was what happened, because after Trevor and his trail family continued on past the 100-mile marker, they were hiking directly into a death trap. And the worst part is they didn't even realize it. So the group continued on until they made it to a popular restaurant that is actually pretty much directly on the PCT called the Paradise Valley Cafe. North of this cafe, the PCT crosses the road and then it enters the San Jacinto Mountains. And folks, this is a section of trail that is largely underestimated by hikers. Just as an example, when I hiked through the San Jacintos on my PCT hike, I was very surprised at how difficult the terrain was compared to the previous 150 miles that I had hiked up to that point. But unlike Trevor and unlike a lot of other PCT hikers, I started my hike much later in the season. I started in May. And so while the San Jacinto section was tough for me, it's not like I encountered any snow or ice or even any difficult weather conditions at all. For hikers that start the trail in March, like Trevor did, or even in April, these late winter conditions are very, very real, and it's often the first time that hikers will encounter these conditions while they head north. An early entry into these mountains requires hikers to carry micro spikes for their feet in order to give them better grip, and an ice axe to aid with slippery traverses or to save your life in case you fall and you need to self-arrest. Well, that's what hikers should carry anyways. But every single year, unprepared hikers enter the San Jacintos without the ice axe and without the micro spikes, not realizing that they're necessary because up until that point, they hadn't needed them at all. And so because of all that, it's been my, albeit anecdotal, observation that the San Jacinto section of the PCT is probably the most dangerous on the entire trail. Numerous hikers have passed away or gone missing in this section, including 2 hikers that I've actually talked about in previous videos. David O'Sullivan went missing there, and John Donovan also went missing there, although he was eventually found years later. Many hikers will actually hitch into the town of Idlewild before they enter the San Jacintos. And this gives the hikers time to rest, it gives them time to resupply, and it gives them time to prepare for the difficult terrain ahead of them. This is actually what I did when I was on the PCT, but a lot of hikers will actually just head straight into the San Jacintos first and then enter Idlewild on a side trail after the first day of difficult hiking is behind them. This is what Trevor and his trail family ended up doing. Trevor left the Paradise Valley Cafe on March 26th and then later made camp on a ridgeline. That evening, he actually had some cell service, and so he gave his dad a call. Him and Doug spoke on the phone, and Doug said that Trevor sounded tired, and he talked about the aggressive pace that the group had been maintaining over the previous few days. Trevor told Doug that the very next day, the group would be entering the town of Idlewild and then taking a few days off and then returning to the PCT with additional equipment like micro spikes and an ice axe. Doug would have had no way of knowing it, but this conversation on the phone with Trevor would end up being the last time that he would ever speak with his son. The next day, at some point in the afternoon, Doug became aware of some news reports which stated that a hiker had died on the PCT. Very close, by the way, to the location where Trevor had camped the night before. This obviously set off many alarm bells in Doug's head. It gave him a lot of anxiety, but at first he was actually able to keep himself calm. At this point, the name of the deceased hiker had not yet been released, and even though Trevor wasn't answering phone calls that Doug was now making to him, Doug knew that at this point in the day, Trevor was likely still hiking and, well, he wouldn't have had cell service. And besides all of that, Doug knew that Trevor was carrying identification with him. He had a driver's license on him, and he was also hiking with other people. He was hiking with his trail family. The news reports stated that a rescue of the deceased hiker had been attempted, but that the hiker had passed before rescuers reached them. Therefore, those rescuers would have been able to identify the hiker and break the news to the hiker's family. Doug hadn't received any contact from the authorities. He hadn't received any contact from search and rescue, and therefore he remained cautiously optimistic that Trevor was fine. However, by 7 p.m. that very same day, this optimism had been completely crushed. Doug knew that Trevor would have reached town by that point, and that he would have most likely reached out like he always did. He would have answered his phone, he would have answered his text messages, but Doug hadn't been able to get in touch with him. And so because of this, Doug made a very, very scary call to the Riverside County Sheriff's Office. He makes this call, and then before he knew it, he was on the phone with the coroner's office. Doug provided them with a photo of Trevor, and when they got back to him after looking over the photo, it was confirmed that the Lauber family's lives were about to change forever. The coroner positively identified the deceased hiker as Trevor. It turns out that Trevor had never made it to Idlewild. On the morning of March 27, 2020, Trevor and his trail family left their campsite, and they were excited to get the next 14 miles of trail behind them so that they could get to town, take a deep breath, and relax. At 9:30 in the morning, while the group was just below the summit of Apache Peak, they encountered a steep slope where the trail had been completely obscured by snow. The group consulted a GPS, and they realized if they traversed straight across this slope that they could rejoin the trail and they could continue on as planned. In 2022, when I hiked the PCT, there was no snow when I approached Apache Peak. However, this spot in particular still stood out to me. So much, in fact, that I actually took this video standing right next to the steep slope that I'm talking about in the rest of this story. This right here is a photo of the exact traverse, which was taken the very next day. Now keep in mind that when the hikers did this traverse, those footprints or the steps that you see in the snow there, well, they wouldn't have been there. Those were from the hikers and later the rescuers that were called in because of what happened next. So Trevor and the rest of his trail family, they stared down this nerve-wracking, dangerous slope, and then they decided to just go for it. One at a time, they began to cross. The first hiker in the group made it across safely, and then they turned around and they waited for everybody else. Trevor Lauber was next. Now, the snow that Trevor was about to walk across may have looked relatively stable, but hidden underneath the top layer of snow was something very, very dangerous. Folks, it was solid ice, and lots of it. After taking a few steps, Trevor's foot landed right on a patch of ice, which threw him off balance. For a few moments after this, he kind of fought to regain his balance, regain his footing, and if he had been able to do so in that moment, I don't think that I would be making this video right now. However, he wasn't able to get his balance back, and he fell down onto this snowy slope. This is a very, very bad situation, but for a few moments there, he actually just kind of sat there. He remained still. And once again, if he had been able to get back on his feet at this point, I wouldn't be making this video right now. Unfortunately, Trevor wasn't able to get back up, and the conditions were so slippery that he wasn't even able to sit there long enough to really formulate a plan. Trevor began sliding uncontrollably down the slope, and he was unable to stop this sliding, he was unable to self-arrest. It didn't take long before he started slamming into rocks, and he just tumbled into a chute completely out of sight of the other hikers. So the other people that Trevor were hiking with immediately contacted rescuers when they saw this happen. They used their emergency beacons, and just a side note here, I highly recommend that every single hiker carry one of these devices. I talk about them a lot, and I always have them linked in the description of my videos, something like a Garmin InReach or a Spot device, something like that. And so they pulled out their emergency beacons, they hit the SOS button, and by the time that they reported Trevor's fall, it was 9:38 in the morning, and within an hour of this, members from the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit and the California Highway Patrol Medic and Air Operations Unit were hovering above the location, facing two very difficult tasks. Task number one was to locate Trevor and hopefully save his life. Task number two was that they had to rescue the pair of hikers who had witnessed Trevor fall, as they too were in great danger in this moment. They were essentially stranded on this dangerous icy slope. Rescuers initially wanted to extract these two hikers with the helicopter, but the windy conditions up on the mountain ended up making this basically impossible. And so the hikers just had to kind of wait there. They just waited there for instructions, they waited for rescue, and they were in such danger and so scared that they actually would end up tying themselves to trees nearby so that they too wouldn't end up sliding into the abyss like they had witnessed with Trevor. These hikers waited for hours in the freezing cold, and in a sick twist of fate, one of them actually happened to notice a Facebook notification on his phone about a PCT hiker who had died in the San Jacintos. This was hours after Trevor had fallen, and once again, this deceased hiker's name was not mentioned, but deep down, Trevor's stranded friend knew, he knew it was Trevor. These two stranded hikers waited all day before they were finally reached by a very brave search and rescue member, and they were given crampons, which allowed them to traverse the ice much more safely, and ultimately they were both hiked back down to town. But shortly after the hikers had initially called 911 and hit that SOS button, rescuers that were hovering in the sky above spotted what they thought was Trevor laying at the bottom of a gorge in an extremely remote area. He had slid very, very far, and the rescuers couldn't even really get to the area very easily. They ended up airdropping a medic at the closest safe spot that they could find, which was about 5 miles away from where Trevor was. And this, another very brave medic, very brave rescuer, hiked into Trevor's location as quickly as he possibly could. But unfortunately, by the time that this medic arrived, Trevor was gone. He had passed away at some point earlier in the day, most likely, obviously from his fall and the injuries that he sustained when he was sliding. The grief that Doug and the rest of the Layer family felt is unimaginable. I certainly can't imagine it. It's tough. It's really tough. And for Doug specifically, he actually felt more than just grief. He felt like he was in some way responsible for his son's death. He asked himself questions like, why hadn't he succeeded in persuading Trevor to leave the trail? Why hadn't he done more research about the dangers around Apache Peak and warned Trevor about this before he got there? Those are just a couple examples. Tons of questions were bouncing around in Doug's head as he struggled to come to terms with what was the greatest tragedy that he had ever experienced in his life. However, in a testament to his strength and his resilience, Doug pushed through these negative emotions and he began to kind of reframe his mindset. He obviously couldn't bring Trevor back, but what he could do was use the energy that he had spent beating himself up on a much more noble cause, a cause that would actually go on to benefit other PCT hikers that were chasing the very same dream that Trevor was. Ever since Trevor's accident, Doug has dedicated himself to educating prospective PCT hikers about safety on the trail. He's gone on podcasts to tell Trevor's story, including my podcast, by the way, which is called Trail Tales. I had him on way back in 2021. Doug has written about Trevor extensively and done his best to spread his story all over social media. And most importantly, Doug started a nonprofit called Trek for Trevor, whose mission is to, quote, promote safe hiking and exploration through preparation, awareness, and education. A major component of Trek for Trevor is a program called Trevor Spikes, which is specifically targeted at Pacific Crest Trail hikers. Trevor Spikes provides a financial stipend to northbound PCT hikers so that they can secure microspikes and ice axes. Once again, those are tools that very likely would have saved Trevor's life. It provides a stipend so that they can secure these tools before they enter the San Jacinto Mountains. Doug was very proud to share with me that last year, 143 hikers took advantage of this program, and he was proud to share that the San Jacinto section of the PCT has seen an 82% reduction in snow/ice related rescues. In addition to, just lives being saved here, this has also saved search and rescue, and the taxpayer for that matter, thousands of dollars. I'm talking like $50,000 to $75,000. Once again, I just want to drive this lesson home here. If Trevor had been wearing microspikes during his traverse on Apache Peak, and if he had been carrying an ice axe, it's very likely that he would have survived. And that's not 100% because you never know, but it's very, very likely. And if you take anything away from this video, it should be that you should always err on the side of caution when you're in the mountains. I highly encourage you to check out Trek for Trevor. They've done such a good job raising awareness, just absolutely incredible, to the point where I believe that they've changed the course of history when it comes to the Pacific Crest Trail. I'll have their site linked in the description. I've made a donation to them, and I highly recommend that you do so as well. And of course, if you're a prospective northbound PCT hiker, go check out the Trevor Spikes program because, well, it just might save your life. I'd really like to thank Doug for being so open about his loss and his pain, and for letting me make this video. Please, everybody, go show some love for him and his family in the comments. And please, please keep Trevor in your thoughts and in your hearts. For nearly 30 years, the quiet rural community around North Pond, Maine, was consumed by an eerie mystery that left even the police baffled. Scattered with seasonal cabins, this beautiful area turned unsettling every single spring as cabin owners returned after long, harsh winters to find their homes violated. Fridges were empty, food had vanished, and essential supplies had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind a trail of confusion and fear around the pond. Batteries had been stripped from flashlights, clothing had been taken from drawers, and propane tanks had been snatched from grills. But oddly enough, valuable items like TVs and jewelry, well, those items were never touched. There were no broken windows, and there were no busted locks. Whoever was responsible for all these robberies had slipped in and out like a ghost, leaving no trace behind. Whoever or whatever was doing this was methodical, careful, and basically impossible to catch. Residents were left to wonder if they were being watched, their homes silently invaded by an unseen presence. Whispers of a shadowy figure spread throughout the town, but nobody ever caught a glimpse. No one ever saw him. Speculation ran wild throughout North Pond. Some people blamed teenagers, other people suspected a cunning neighbor might be responsible, and many people began to doubt their own memory, thinking that they had just simply misplaced the missing items. But as the years stretched on and these mysterious break-ins continued, a chilling realization began to sink in. Someone had been living among the residents of North Pond, hiding in the wilderness, silently preying on their cabins, basically using them as his own personal Walmart. For nearly 3 decades, nobody knew his name, or where he came from for that matter, until one day, everything changed. This is the unbelievable story of a man nicknamed the North Pond Hermit. Folks, this is one of the most unique stories that I've ever covered, hands down, and it raises a very interesting moral question that I'd like your feedback on once you're done watching this video. I kind of have a feeling that a lot of you are going to be divided on this, so make sure you watch the entire story, and then once you do, please leave your respectful comments down below. One of my viewers from Maine actually suggested this story to me, so whoever you are, thank you very much. And with that said, I'd like to invite you on a virtual trip to that very state, a state that I know very, very well, the great state of Maine. This virtual trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission and to also help us reach our ambitious goal of hitting 1 million subscribers. We're getting up there, folks, and so please hit that subscribe button, especially if you're a repeat viewer. And okay, let's do it. To start this story off, I want to introduce you to a very peculiar man named Christopher Knight. Christopher and his 5 siblings grew up in the small town of Albion, Maine, and to be honest with you, there isn't really much known about his upbringing, but from what I gathered, there certainly wasn't any red flags or indicators that something was wrong. Christopher was apparently a really good student, so good in fact that he even ended up graduating high school early. Everything pretty much seemed normal. I mean, the only even slightly negative aspect of his upbringing that stood out to me is that he apparently had a difficult time making friends, which you could maybe take that as a bit of a yellow flag, but it's not exactly uncommon for people in high school either. Now, folks, I've spent a lot of time in Maine. I have a bunch of friends there. My mother was born and raised in Aroostook County. And most importantly, I've seen every single episode of Northwood's Law, so I can tell you very confidently that the great outdoors, they're just a way of life in Maine. And this was certainly true for Christopher Knight and the rest of his family. He spent time hunting with his father, and he was comfortable in the woods. I mean, almost everybody in rural Maine is. And yet, despite being so familiar with the wild, something curious stands out about his early days. Christopher never spent a single night in a tent. He never camped alone, and for a boy that was raised in the deep woods of Maine, this fact seems oddly out of place, especially when you consider the events that would occur later in his life. After graduating high school, Christopher Knight went to technical school in Waltham, Massachusetts, and shortly thereafter, he landed a job in that very same area installing security alarm systems, which is quite ironic, I have to say, for reasons that you'll understand very shortly. He worked in Massachusetts for some time, but then, on a otherwise unremarkable day in 1986, something in him changed. Without warning, Christopher Knight abandoned everything. His job, his life in Massachusetts. He got in his car and he just started driving north all the way back to Maine. He drove through his hometown of Albion, past familiar roads and faces, but he didn't stop there. He kept driving deeper and deeper into the wilderness, down dirt roads as far as his car would take him. And then, when the gas gauge hit empty while he was on a remote, unmarked road, he parked his car, he grabbed a backpack, and he simply just walked into the woods. I'm not sure how long he was planning on staying in the woods. To be honest with you, I don't think he knew either. But as fate would have it, when Christopher Knight stepped into those woods, it would be 27 years before he'd step out of them and spend another night inside. When Christopher Knight first set off into the woods, he was near Moosehead Lake, which is the largest lake in Maine. Folks, there he was, completely alone, with no plan, hardly any experience, and no idea what was going to happen next. Which is A very incredible realization to come to. I mean, think about this. All of a sudden, this kid who had never spent the night in a tent was all alone by himself, wandering through the remote Maine forest, again, with no idea what he was going to do, no plan at all. This reality obviously hit him very hard. I mean, he had super limited supplies in his backpack, and more than anything, what he needed was food. At first, he survived by essentially just scavenging, even resorting to eating roadkill at times just to keep himself going. I mean, he was truly desperate. He would take advantage of any food source that he could find, but it didn't take long for him to realize that scavenging just wasn't gonna cut it. One day, while he was wandering through the woods, he came upon the garden of a remote, unoccupied cabin. And folks, just like that, fresh vegetables were sitting there right in front of his face. Now, he knew it was wrong to steal, but the hunger that was gnawing at him was stronger than his guilt. And so he filled up his backpack with as much as he could carry, and then he slipped silently back into the forest. Now, it might not have seemed like much, and it might not have seemed like a big deal, but this small act of desperation seemed to unlock something within Christopher. And so what started as a single benign theft would quickly transform into his key to survival. It was the easiest and the most effective way to feed, clothe, and protect himself. Over the next few years, Christopher Knight would transform into an expert thief, stealthily breaking into unoccupied cabins, usually in the early morning hours, raiding the fridge, the pantry, and the closets, and then getting out as quickly as he possibly could. Though these thefts allowed Christopher to continue his life in the wilderness, deep down, he always knew that it was wrong. He was careful to avoid people during his heists, and he never even considered confronting someone violently. In fact, he never even carried a firearm, which is something you think someone in the woods would actually be carrying. Christopher wasn't a criminal in the usual sense. He simply wanted to just continue to survive in his secluded world. These thefts, these raids, these heists, they quietly ate away at him, and yet he continued to do them, knowing that if he slipped up just one time, it would absolutely shatter his new life of solitude, and of course, it would likely land him behind bars. Christopher Knight's family was concerned after he disappeared, even to the point where they hired a private investigator to try and track him down. But with that said, I don't know why this is, but they never reported him missing to the police. And thus, for the first 2 years, he slowly moved his way south through the Maine woods and remained completely undetected. But then, one random day, he stumbled into the Belgrade Lakes area, which is near the town of Rome, Maine. He set up his usual campsite, except this time, he never left. The campsite that he chose was surrounded by thick woods and large boulders, which allowed him to remain completely out of sight and to stay hidden. Due to these factors, and due to the plethora of cabins nearby, Christopher Knight decided that this campsite would become his permanent home. He didn't know it at the time. He carried no map or compass with him, but this chosen campsite was less than 30 miles away from where he had grown up in Albion. It was also very close to the shores of North Pond. And so after settling down near the pond, Christopher stepped up his burglary skills to a whole new level. He began to spy on the residents of nearby cabins, silently studying their routines. He knew when they arrived, he knew when they left, and he also knew how long they would be gone for. He would meticulously plan his break-ins, only moving at night, usually during the middle of the week when less people were around. He got so sophisticated with this that he would even use the weather as his ally, opting to strike during heavy rain, knowing that the sound of the downpouring would mask his movements. He was careful to avoid roads and trails, and he was also intentional about avoiding any patterns or routines. He would always shave his face and put on his cleanest clothes before he headed out to do a raid, so that if someone did spot him, he wouldn't look like just some crazed man living in the woods. He did not want to appear like some wild man in rags. He wanted to appear as ordinary as possible. His skills became so refined that he would steal discarded canoes from the lakeside homes, and then he would paddle silently across the water under the cover of darkness. I mean, this is just insane, and it's very bold. Stealing canoes in order to help steal other items. I mean, using these canoes actually allowed him to haul more supplies than he could just simply carry on foot, so he would fill up the canoes, and this made his nighttime raids even more effective. But something that's important to note here is that after he was done using the canoe to restock his supplies, Christopher would always return it. Part of this was to avoid detection, of course. I mean, he knew that a missing canoe would raise suspicions and it would likely be reported to the police. But there was also something deeper at play here. Christopher was a thief. I mean, there's no denying that. And yet, he seemed to commit his crimes with this odd sense of respect for his victims, if that makes sense. I mean, it probably doesn't. It sounds very strange, but he really tried to minimize the impact of his break-ins as much as possible. He stole, of course, but he wasn't out to destroy or to vandalize. He never trashed the cabins that he raided. He avoided breaking doors or windows whenever possible, and on the rare occasion that he did, he made a genuine effort to repair the damage. Once again, his raids were always unarmed, and violence was never an option. In fact, he went out of his way to be invisible, both in his actions and in his presence. One of the most telling moments of this came when he stole a mattress from one of the nearby cabins. Instead of breaking the door down in order to move the mattress out, he chose to enter through a window. He then carefully removed the door from its hinges, hauled the mattress outside, and then reassembled the door just as he had found it. Christopher Knight stole this mattress because once he had settled into his permanent camp, he was determined to strike the perfect balance between stealth and comfort. Food was always the biggest prize of his raids, but over time, things like clothing, cooking supplies, even books were also focused on. And yet, second to only food, one thing was essential above all else. That was propane. Propane tanks became one of the most frequently stolen items from the cabins around North Pond. With propane, Christopher Knight could cook his food, he could purify his water, and he could keep himself warm during Maine's brutal winters, which year after year, by the way, proved to be his biggest challenge to survival. Now, if you've never been to Maine before, let me tell you, the winters are extremely harsh, and they're also a very important part of Christopher Knight's story. I think it's very easy to romanticize what he was doing, you know, this guy that leaves society behind to go live amongst nature. Hell, I've probably even done some of this romanticizing in this video, but regardless of the romance, the charm of what Christopher Knight was doing completely wore off by, say, early December. Winter never got easier for Christopher. In fact, with each passing year, as he got older and older, winter became more and more deadly. On multiple occasions, he nearly died because of these brutal temperatures and brutal winter conditions, and this left him with no choice but to adapt. He had to do this if he was going to stay out there in the woods, and thus, after a few years, Christopher became as meticulous with his winter survival strategy as he was with his burglary strategy. Many of the cabins around North Pond were only occupied during the summer, and as the residents packed up and left each fall, Christopher Knight saw this as his golden opportunity. With the area deserted, he ramped up his raids, stealing food, propane, and other crucial supplies. As I said, winter in Maine is just straight up unforgiving. And Christopher Knight knew that once the deep cold set in, moving around too much would be risky. He might leave footprints, and it also just takes a lot more effort when it's freezing cold outside. And so every single fall would turn into a frantic race to gather enough provisions to survive the long, brutal months ahead. Christopher also used the fall, I'm just gonna be blunt here, he used the fall as the time to get fat. Just like the bears that he would occasionally spot in the woods, he used this time to bulk himself up. He would stuff himself with as much stolen food as he could get his hands on. Gaining weight wasn't just preparation for him, it was a matter of life and death. During the fall, he would also take the time to grow out his beard to the perfect length, which was long enough to protect his face from the biting wind, but short enough to avoid frostbite from ice building up on his beard. Now, it goes without saying that the biggest asset to his survival would have been his ability to make fire, but he actually never did this. He completely avoided making fires because he didn't want anyone to notice the flames through the woods. One of the most fascinating winter strategies that Christopher employed was actually his sleeping schedule. He would fall asleep very early in the evening, and then he would get up at 2 in the morning and start melting snow for his drinking water. The reason that he did this is because he was afraid that if he fell asleep for too long in the cold, well, he might not wake up at all. Christopher Knight survived 27 brutal Maine winters, and after 27 years of perfecting this routine, he basically had winter survival down to a science. But after nearly 3 decades of stealing from the cabins around North Pond, the residents and the police, well, they were starting to catch on to Christopher. His raids, which were once undetectable, were now becoming this undeniable pattern, and the quiet community that he preyed upon was beginning to piece together the mystery. As the years passed, the residents of North Pond began to come together with all of these stories of food, flashlights, propane, and even mattresses vanishing from their cabins without a trace. Nobody knew who was responsible, but eventually the residents began coining various nicknames for this unknown intruder. Some people called him the Mountain Man, other people called him the Hungry Man because he would steal so much food, but one name stuck out above all the rest, and that name was the North Pond Hermit. Even though nobody ever saw this man, I want to make it clear that his cabin raids wreaked havoc on the small community. It left residents extremely uneasy, especially because it had just gone on for so long. And I actually think that this very long quote from one of the residents really sums up the fear that Christopher had caused. Quote, "Unless you've experienced the 27 years of looking over your shoulder while walking around your camp at night and during the day, arriving at camp to find food, batteries, books, watches, etc. stolen, feeling that you're being watched constantly, feeling violated from someone breaking into your camp and going through your personal things, eventually questioning whether it's your neighbors who are guilty of these crimes, and also having to spend thousands of dollars on repairs and materials just trying to barricade your camp to make it break-in proof, you really, I don't think, have an idea of the magnitude of the impact this experience has had on all of our lives." Residents, the police, and the Maine Warden Service all began to work tirelessly to catch this unknown intruder, and for years and years, he was able to evade them until, in 2001, the residents of North Pond finally got their first glimpse at the Hermit. A wise resident had hidden a motion-sensing camera in his cabin, and one night, it snapped this photo right here. This photo shows a man bent over going through the refrigerator. But folks, this was not your typical midnight snack attack. This was the very first time that Christopher Knight was captured on camera during one of his raids. Oh, and by the way, it wouldn't be the last time either, but we're gonna get there. Despite this huge break in the case, and despite this photo being circulated all over Maine, another 10 years of raids and burglary went by before anybody caught another glimpse of the North Pond Hermit. 10 years. I mean, that's so much time if you think about it. Residents of North Pond came and went. Children who had grown up spending summers at the pond went off to college, and each year brought more frustration for the police, who were working overtime hunting the Hermit, but always came up empty-handed. The North Pond Hermit's legend only deepened as he continued to evade capture year after year after year. But then, in 2013, everything changed. In a sudden twist, the case that had gripped North Pond for decades was blown wide open, unraveling the mystery that had kept the community on edge for so damn long. In April of 2012, the Hermit was once again captured on a security camera, this time in much higher resolution. And then, a few months later, when a resident was allegedly sleeping, the Hermit broke in and the resident yelled at him and then he ran away. And although these two men never actually saw each other, it was yet another example of the Hermit's cover nearly being blown. And finally, on April 4th, 2013, Christopher Knight broke into the Pine Tree Camp, which is this summer camp that he had frequently, perhaps a little too frequently, targeted before. By this point, Sergeant Terry Hughes of the Maine Warden Service had made it his personal mission to catch the Hermit. He had studied the North Pond Hermit's patterns, patiently waiting for the moment when he would slip up. Christopher Knight had been very careful, obviously, but Sergeant Hughes was absolutely relentless. He knew that the Hermit would return to Pine Tree Camp, which Christopher Knight had basically been treating like his personal Walmart for years and years and years. So Sergeant Hughes was determined to catch him, and unlike previous residents who had captured the Hermit's image, Sergeant Hughes went a step further and actually installed a full-blown motion detection system that would trigger an alarm in his home, which was located literally just a mile away from the Pine Tree Camp. Every single night, this determined warden went to bed waiting for that moment where the alarm would sound, and on the night of April 4th, it finally did. Sergeant Hughes heard the alarm, he knew this was his chance, and so he jumped in his truck and he sped towards Pine Tree Camp. He gets there, he gets out of his truck, and he moved swiftly, cutting off the Hermit's escape route, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. His flashlight beam landed right on Christopher Knight's face, this man who had eluded capture for so long, and with his pistol trained on the Hermit, Sergeant Hughes had finally caught him completely red-handed. I mean, Christopher Knight's pockets were still stuffed with stolen food. His hands were still gripping supplies from this raid in progress. In this fateful moment, the legendary North Pond Hermit stood completely exposed, his secret life unraveling in the cold night air. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He just simply surrendered, offering only a few quiet words. After 27 years of isolation and shadowy survival, the North Pond Hermit's time in the woods had come to a silent yet inevitable end. Christopher Knight spent the next 7 months behind bars, which is a very stark and agonizing contrast to the solitude of the woods that he had called home for 27 years. The isolation of a jail cell was absolutely suffocating for a man who had spent so long in silence, alone with nature. Christopher Knight barely spoke during his time in jail. I mean, so many years had passed without him ever talking to another human that he had almost forgotten how to talk in the first place. The only reason that we even know about his time in jail, and the details of his 27 years in the woods for that matter, is because one persistent and friendly journalist was able to break through his wall of silence. A man named Michael Finkel, a journalist who was intrigued by the Hermit's story, began writing letters to Christopher Knight and eventually visited him at the Kennebec County Jail. For reasons that are only known to Knight himself, he chose to open up to Finkel. Through these rare moments of communication, Finkel pieced together the extraordinary tale of Christopher Knight's life in the woods. And the results of their conversations became a series of articles and then later a book, which is called The Stranger in the Woods. And I'll have this book linked in the description if you want an even greater deep dive into this story. By the time Christopher Knight was sentenced, he was basically just sentenced to time served. He had spent 7 months in jail, and he was also ordered to pay $2,000 to the victims of his burglaries. He was ordered to complete a 17-month specialty court program. He was ordered to stay away from drugs and alcohol. And then he was released on probation, which lasted for 3 years. One of the most astonishing aspects of this, incredibly astonishing story is that it's estimated that Christopher Knight committed more than 1,000 burglaries over the years, which is something that he expressed immense guilt over while he was confiding to Finkel and during his court hearings. Now, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to this story, a question that I'm sure many of you have been wondering about since basically the start of this video. This question is, why? Why did Christopher Knight suddenly abandon society, vanish into the wilderness, and endure brutal winter after brutal winter all alone in the woods? I wish that Christopher Knight had given a good answer to this question. I wish that there was an obvious reason behind why he did what he did, but the truth is, we still don't really know why. Hell, it seems like even he doesn't know why he did it. Maybe it was supposed to only be like a temporary thing, and then all of the guilt from the break-ins caused him to just retreat further away from society. That's just my speculation. Maybe he stayed in the woods for so long that he began to fear returning to a world that he no longer recognized. Or maybe he was just a lost soul, and there really is no true reason for what he did. The only thing even close to an explanation that I was able to find was that in the woods, Christopher Knight found contentment. The legacy of the North Pond Hermit remains very divisive. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that many of you will find yourself on different sides of this story. And it's because of this, at the beginning of the video, I asked for your feedback. And so now we're there. This is where I'd appreciate your comments, all of your feedback, your respectful opinions about Christopher Knight. On one hand, there's something that's undeniably romantic about the life that Christopher Knight led. This idea of retreating into nature and embracing complete solitude. I mean, this is a fantasy that many of us have entertained, even if for only, some fleeting moments. For most people, I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's a daydream, essentially. But Christopher Knight didn't just dream it, he actually lived it. And while he was most certainly a thief, he was never violent, and there's something in his unwavering dedication to solitude that's almost worthy of respect. But on the other hand, he was a criminal. I mean, he openly admitted this, he pled guilty, and he carried the weight of guilt for all of his raids and burglaries for all 27 years that he was in the woods. And even though he was never violent, he still terrorized the community around North Pond. He was never spotted, but his presence was certainly felt, leaving residents, families, even children extremely uneasy. His crimes, stealing from hardworking people who valued their property, were not without consequence. For those who lived near North Pond, Christopher Knight's actions weren't just unsettling, they were infuriating. If I lived near North Pond during all of this, I would have been straight up pissed off, to be frank. And so I can understand where both his critics and his supporters are coming from. So let me know what you think. And again, please leave your comments respectful. If you're too colorful in your language, YouTube is just gonna automatically ban your comments anyways. And yeah, just let me know what you think about the story of the North Pond Hermit. On a very normal late spring day in 2019, 4 thru-hikers made their way down the Appalachian Trail. Their thoughts were almost certainly filled with the typical things that long-distance hikers think about. I'm talking things like, where's the next water source? Where should we camp tonight? And perhaps most importantly, what should we eat when we reach town and have our next hot meal? Everything about this day checked out. Everything was normal until the group encountered this man right here. Now, these 4 hikers had walked over 500 miles up to this point, and they had most certainly encountered quite a bit of characters, if you know what I mean. However, this particular man was much different than some random, eccentric stranger that they encountered in the woods. This man was dangerous, and by this point in time, he was well known, even infamous, among the Appalachian Trail community. While walking along the trail, this man had exhibited every red flag in the book, and by this point, pretty much every single hiker along the trail had been warned to stay far away from him. The 4 hikers who now stood before this man knew exactly who he was. This disturbed man was known by the trail name Sovereign. But with that said, and unbeknownst to the 4 hikers who were now watching him play his guitar and ramble about, this man was about to become known by a much more sinister name. That name would be the Appalachian Trail Killer. The group left this man behind and they continued down the trail. But this man would soon follow in their footsteps, and then, later that night, while the tired hikers hunkered down in their tents, this deranged man, he would strike, and he would send shock waves that were felt throughout the Appalachian Trail from Georgia all the way up to Maine. This is the story of James Jordan, the Appalachian Trail Killer. So, as my regular viewers know at this point, I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2018. I talk about it all the time. I'm very proud of it. And because of this, I was in a bunch of AT-related Facebook groups that I just never left after my thru-hike. And so the following spring, when the 2019 hikers began making their way north, I vividly remember seeing discussion after discussion about this dangerous hiker who was on the trail. There were tons of reports about him threatening other hikers. I mean, so many people were talking about this. They were posting photos of him, and he was just acting very unstable and very, very sketchy. I remember following all of this stuff. I remember kind of hearing about the story developing in real time. And then one morning, I woke up, I opened Facebook. I still remember this very vividly. I opened Facebook to see tons of posts about how this dangerous man, this dangerous hiker, had finally carried out the ultimate act of violence. It had only been about 7 months since I had finished my thru hike, not even a full year. And so when this news broke, it just tore my heart apart, honestly. I mean, the Appalachian Trail is a place that had brought me so much joy. It was the inspiration for why I even started this YouTube channel in the first place. And it just broke my heart that this very special place to me was also the same place where such a heinous crime was carried out. I honestly put off covering this particular story for a long time. I mean, I've gotten tons of requests about it. Even though I wasn't involved with it, obviously, just the timing and everything, fresh off my thru hike, it just made me feel so terrible. And so, yeah, I've put off covering it, but I have a reason for finally telling this story now, which is something I'm going to get into at the very end of the video. So please watch until the end. And also, with that said, please hit the subscribe button because we're trying to get to 1 million subscribers and we're getting up there, honestly. Please help us with that. And so, with that said, let me introduce you to a man named Ronald Sanchez Jr. Ronald Sanchez Jr. was a native of Garden Grove, California, and he would go on to honorably serve the United States as an Army combat engineer during the Iraq War. Now, folks, from what I've gathered, he was in it when it comes to the war. I mean, he saw friends in his unit die. He himself suffered physical injuries. And again, from what I've gathered, those injuries paled in comparison to the mental injuries that he suffered upon his return home to the United States. What I'm talking about, of course, as you probably predicted, is PTSD. As Ronald tried to adjust to normal life back home, he found himself unable to leave his apartment for days at a time. He would be frightened by loud noises, and he would even go as far as purposely avoiding human interaction. I mean, to the point where he would only go out for food and supplies at night when there was far less people in the stores and far less people around. Eventually, however, after a lot of hard work, a lot of therapy and physical exercise, Ronald Sanchez Jr., he began to recover. And one activity in particular that began to bring him a lot of joy was hiking. He started out with just short day hikes, meetups. It was kind of a way to make new friends, but that eventually turned into a very ambitious goal, which was to thru hike the Appalachian Trail. Ronald saw this as a new opportunity to heal from his PTSD, and by the early spring of 2019, he found himself standing on Springer Mountain, which is the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. So that's our introduction to Ronald Sanchez Jr. And so next, I need to introduce another man to this story. And this is a man that would eventually cross paths with Ronald with disastrous and evil results. This man is named James Jordan. James Jordan's childhood was just plagued with tragedy and struggle. His father OD'd and died when James was only 6 years old, and his mother reportedly struggled very hard with alcoholism. James would unfortunately follow in his parents' footsteps when it came to substance abuse, and he began drinking and smoking marijuana from a very young age, far too young to be doing any of that stuff. These habits would result in his first brush with the law, which occurred at age 13 when he was arrested for auto burglary. Flash forward to age 16, and James's mother moved his family from their home of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to a town that I actually know very well because it's really close to where I grew up. This town is Winooski, Vermont. After moving to Winooski, James Jordan's problems only grew worse as he was frequently heard yelling at his mother through the walls of their apartment. Obviously, he was extremely troubled. He would just wander around town at night. He would sell marijuana, and on at least one occasion, he did something that was just an extreme red flag. According to some research I did, James was out late one night. He was with a friend, and as the pair walked by a pond, James reportedly stomped a frog to death, and then he ripped it up using a knife. And I want you to remember, he was only in high school at this time. And it's been well documented that torturing and abusing animals like this is an early warning sign that an individual may someday become violent towards other humans. A little bit of a spoiler for you there. Eventually, James Jordan would end up being kicked out of his mother's apartment. He would go on to essentially just live as a vagabond, selling drugs to get by. And it's also during this time that he became more and more delusional, for the lack of a better word. He was clearly suffering from some very serious mental health issues. So now we're going to flash forward to age 22. At this point, James was arrested for drug possession, and he would ultimately end up at the University of Vermont Medical Center, another place I know very well. I have a lot of friends that work there. He would end up there so that his mental fitness could be evaluated. But unfortunately, this wouldn't make any difference, and it didn't take long before James Jordan was back on the streets, growing ever more paranoid with each passing day. As an example of this, James thought that the government was trying to get him for some reason. He refused to take medication to help his mental state, and eventually he wound up in Florida, of all places, where he would go on to get arrested numerous times for various petty offenses. But around this same time and through his travels, James Jordan apparently found at least a little bit of joy for the first time in his life. This is going to sound really cliche, but this is the truth. James Jordan started to spend some time in nature. This certainly didn't stop his delusions, but he apparently enjoyed being in nature so much that by April of 2019, he found himself on the Appalachian Trail with a pit bull by his side. And within just a few short weeks of this, he would cross paths with Ronald Sanchez Jr. So back to Ronald for a moment. His Appalachian Trail thru hike didn't really start out the way that he wanted to. He completed the first 100 miles of the AT, which is an accomplishment that's worth celebrating, but he soon found that his body just wasn't adjusting to the trail as easily as he would have liked. And this is something that's very, very common. I've seen it on both of my long thru hikes. So he stopped for a little bit, he rested, I think it was for a few weeks, and then he found himself back on the trail. He found himself heading north, and he was now going by the trail name Stronghold. This trail name had actually been given to him by some of his fellow hikers when they learned about his time serving the US in Iraq. Pretty badass trail name, I do have to say. So Stronghold made some pretty good progress on the trail at this point, and he eventually stumbled into the town of Damascus, Virginia. Damascus is just shy of the 500-mile marker on the trail, which again is a massive achievement. But despite all of the progress that he had made up to this point, he was feeling lonely. Spending hours and hours by himself, day in and day out, was starting to take a toll on him, and so he quit, and he returned to his home in Oklahoma. When he went home, he thought that was it. He thought his Appalachian Trail dream was over. But after he had a few days to reflect, a few days in the comfort of his own house, he realized that he still had more to give. He felt as though getting off the AT was actually a mistake. And so before heading back to the trail, he spent some time with his therapist. He went on a few warm-up day hikes, and then he traveled back to Damascus to continue hiking north. By the time that he got back on the trail, it was now early May of 2019. When Stronghold resumed his hike, he would have heard these warnings about a troubled hiker named Sovereign. He probably saw these warnings before he even returned back to Damascus. Now, Sovereign was the trail name of James Jordan, and although James Jordan had only been on the Appalachian Trail for a few short weeks, he had caused enough trouble that just about every person on the AT knew to look out for him. Hell, like I mentioned earlier, even people like myself that weren't even on the trail had heard tons about this guy. Warnings and photos of him had been plastered all over social media, and these photos were soon rounded out by a brand new mugshot of James Jordan. James Jordan's trouble started in mid-April when he allegedly threatened multiple hikers with a shovel at a trail shelter known as Jerry's Cabin, which is right on the North Carolina-Tennessee border. These hikers had reported the incident to the police, which prompted the sheriff of Unicoi County, Tennessee, to say, quote, "We knew there was trouble down here with this boy. What really got my attention was that one of the hikers said he told them, quote, 'It's going to be a bad day for hikers on the trail,' which is obviously a huge red flag. And there were also rumors floating around that James Jordan may have been carrying a machete, which again, another huge red flag. Now, the sheriff was initially unable to locate James Jordan after these reports came in, but only a day or two later, authorities in North Carolina, because the trail actually straddles the state line through this area, authorities in North Carolina were able to make contact with him. And yet, despite his threats, despite all these red flags, the authorities let him walk free. And the reason for this is because they didn't really have any solid evidence that he had committed a crime, and he also didn't have any pending warrants for his arrest. But then, on April 21st, James Jordan was spotted at a trailhead, apparently asking hikers for the password that he needed to, enter the trail. This strange and bizarre behavior was once again reported on social media. I remember following all this stuff in real time. It's so crazy to me. And then the next day, April 22nd, James Jordan was finally arrested after getting into a verbal altercation with some other hikers. When he was arrested, James Jordan was found to be in possession of a fake ID, marijuana, and probably most disturbingly, a very large hunting knife. He was finally brought into custody, but unfortunately, he wouldn't remain there for very long. So I think some of you might have some things to say about this next part of the story in the comments section. And so I'm going to try to tread carefully here. But none of the hikers who had been threatened or assaulted by James Jordan were willing to go to court to testify against him. And I'm speculating here 100%, but I imagine that the reason for this was because they were out there to hike the trail. They didn't have cars or transportation. They were on a very strict schedule, and having to remain in the area off trail in hotels would get very expensive, and it would also just be a giant logistical nightmare that would have huge impacts on their hike. Again, that's speculation, but just putting myself in their shoes, I feel like honestly I wouldn't have wanted to remain in the area to testify. And so With that said, in hindsight, I do think it's fair to say that these hikers should have made that sacrifice in order to help put James Jordan behind bars. But again, I hope I explained that well. You can at least kind of understand why they didn't, right? And of course, hindsight is 2020. I'm sure they would have done this if they knew what would go on to happen later. And so please just go easy on these people. Again, I probably would have done the same thing as them if I was in their shoes and I knew what they knew at the time. Because nobody was willing to testify against him in court, James Jordan was only charged for the drugs and for the fake ID, which are 2 minor offenses, and he was released very quickly. He was ordered to stay away from the Appalachian Trail, but predictably, he didn't listen to that order. He pretty much immediately went back to the AT, and when he did, all of the reports of his erratic and threatening behavior picked right back up where they had left off. Because of all the attention and all the chatter about him, a very well-meaning trail angel decided to step up and find a solution that would get James Jordan off the Appalachian Trail. Now, if you're not familiar with this, a trail angel is a person who supports hikers on their journey, often giving them rides into town or providing them with fresh food at road crossings. And so on May 2nd, 2019, a trail angel named Odie encountered James Jordan at a trailhead, and of course, he instantly recognized him from all of the warnings that had been posted on social media. Odie knew that he had to do something in this moment, and so he actually invited James Jordan to dinner, and surprisingly, James accepted. So they drive into town together, and over the course of this meal, James told Odie that he had some relatives that lived away from the Appalachian Trail in Maryland. Odie was very quick thinking. I actually met him on my thru hike very briefly. He's a super smart, very quick thinking guy, and so he saw this as an opportunity to get James off the trail, and Odie asked James if he would be interested in a free bus ticket to Maryland to where his relatives lived. James Jordan apparently appreciated this, and so by the next morning, the two of them traveled to Johnson City and James boarded a bus. I think we should all appreciate Odie's efforts here. He knew that James Jordan was dangerous, but he still took him in, and he drove him and his dog, for that matter, his pit bull, nearly 100 miles off trail to the bus station. That's quite risky and very admirable of Odie to do. I remember hearing about this at the time, and I honestly felt very relieved that this man who had been causing so much trouble on the AT was finally off the trail for good. I also remember many folks in the Appalachian Trail community celebrating this, but unfortunately, the threat that James Jordan posed to other hikers was not yet over. In fact, as much as it pains me to say this, it was really just beginning. Now, it's unclear to me exactly what happened here, but allegedly, James Jordan only traveled one stop on the bus, and then him and his pit bull got off. He then, somehow, again, I have no idea how, made his way back to the Appalachian Trail, and predictably, the reports of him harassing hikers picked right back up. Ronald Sanchez Jr. and James Jordan would meet for the first time along the trail on May 10th while hiking through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. Ronald, or Stronghold, was accompanied by 3 other hikers at this point, and when the group encountered James Jordan, it appeared that he was up to his usual tricks. He was reportedly singing and playing his guitar and just acting bizarre. He acted, quote, disturbed and unstable. Stronghold and his companions quickly left James Jordan behind, and they continued hiking north for a few miles until they eventually decided to stop and make camp for the evening. And then, after darkness fell, when all of the hikers were in their tents for the night trying to sleep, James Jordan appeared yet again. Except this time, he was acting even more erratic and violent than he ever had before. This is just an absolute nightmare scenario. While the hikers were trying to sleep, James Jordan threatened to, quote, pour gasoline on their tents and burn them to death. And so obviously with this threat, the hikers were wide awake, and they made the very wise decision to pack up their gear and to hike on to a different campsite, even though it was now in the early morning hours of May 11th, like 1 or 2 a.m. However, my backpacker viewers will know this. Packing up your gear, it's not a quick process. Even the fastest people it's going to take a few minutes at the very least. And while they were packing up all their gear, James Jordan came at the hikers with a knife. In reaction to this, 2 of the hikers ran off into the dark woods, and James Jordan chased them. However, they were thankfully able to outrun him, and they were able to hide. And so at this point, James Jordan gave up on the chase. He turned around and he went back to the campsite, and he zeroed in on Sanchez and a female hiker who was there with him. Sanchez, or Stronghold, he stepped up and he did what he had been trained to do in the army, which was defend his life and defend the life of the innocent hiker that he was with. He also sent out an SOS call from his phone, alerting the authorities for the very first time that something very bad was going down along the Appalachian Trail. An altercation took place, and tragically, this altercation ended with Ronald Sanchez Jr. being stabbed to death. James Jordan's rampage didn't end here either. After he took down Sanchez, he turned his attention to this female hiker who then took off running like the other hikers had earlier. This time, however, James Jordan wasn't outran, and he caught up to the female hiker who threw her hands up and tried to surrender, trying to save her life. Folks, James Jordan showed zero mercy. When the hiker threw her arms up, he began stabbing her until she fell down to the ground and pretended to play dead. Thankfully, James Jordan fell for this, and after she fell down, he returned back to the campsite in order to locate his pit bull. So this next part of the story just is absolutely incredible. In a testament to her strength and her will to survive, this female hiker got up and then she ran down the trail in search of help and in search of rescue. She ended up encountering a pair of hikers who were camped nearby, and they joined her on the pitch black 6-mile hike out of the wilderness. And I just want to sit in this for a second. 6 miles. She's just been stabbed. She's bleeding. She was just so strong that after all of this, she was still able to hike 6 miles at night in order to reach safety. Folks, that's just straight up badass. There's pretty much no other way to describe it. This female hiker was transported to the nearest hospital, and thankfully, she would survive. We're actually going to come back to her at the end of the story. But, as I mentioned, Ronald Sanchez Jr. would not survive. By pure random chance, this healing journey that he had set out on the Appalachian Trail would end up costing him his life, which it's honestly painful to say out loud. Again, as someone who just loves the AT so much. James Jordan would end up grabbing his dog and then kind of just stumbling around the trail in the dark. Around 4 a.m., he noticed yet another pair of hikers asleep in their tent, and he yelled at them that he needed their flashlight. This was very scary and confusing to the hikers, who I'm sure were sound asleep in their tent, and they obliged, but thankfully they didn't get out of the tent and further entertain the violent man. They just unzipped it a little bit and they handed him the flashlight, no questions asked. Thank God that's all they did, because if they had gotten out, then it's very likely that they too would have become victims. After the authorities received Ronald Sanchez Jr.'s SOS call, they dispatched to the trail and they made the 6-mile hike into the area using Sanchez's GPS coordinates as their target destination. They didn't really know exactly what had happened, but just after 6 a.m., they stumbled into the campsite turned murder scene and immediately noticed a stray pit bull kind of just wandering around the forest. They followed this dog and it led them straight to James Jordan, who was very scarily still standing right next to the tent of the hikers who had given him the flashlight a few hours earlier. He was covered in blood, and thankfully, he was arrested, without resistance, I might add. And shortly after this, the officers found Ronald Sanchez Jr.'s body, and they also found the knife that had been used to kill him. James Jordan was marched out of the woods in handcuffs, finally ending his reign of terror on the Appalachian Trail. The legal proceedings that followed James Jordan's arrest are honestly a bit messy, mostly because they weren't sure whether or not he was actually mentally fit to stand trial. In fact, that was the exact ruling by a U.S. District Court judge, but this decision was later reversed, and James Jordan was in fact charged with murder and assault. However, long story short, when it comes to this, in the spring of 2021, after some delays and yet even more of a mess because of COVID and all that and all the court systems getting backed up, ultimately, James Jordan was ruled not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was committed to a psychiatric institution where he is supposed to remain until he won't create a, quote, substantial risk of injury to another human being. As far as I can tell, James Jordan has not yet been released as of the making of this video. And honestly, this is just my opinion, but I sure hope he doesn't get released anytime soon. And it is worth mentioning that at the time of this ruling, Jordan's lawyers released a statement saying that he is now, quote, deeply remorseful for the profound sorrow that he has caused, and that, quote, he regrets that his lifelong battle with mental illness ultimately resulted in this trauma and loss for innocent hikers and their families. Folks, this doesn't mark the end of our story. 4 months after the attack, the female hiker who had been stabbed and then made her way out, again, just absolutely incredible. This female hiker made her way up Mount Katahdin in Maine, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. She initially, while she was in the hospital, wanted to get back on trail when she was ready and continue her through hike, but she ended up just needing more time to recover. She obviously suffered some very, very severe injuries. But then 4 months later, she still needed some closure, and she figured that climbing Katahdin with some of the friends that she had made on the trail would be a symbolic way to move past the horrific events that she had lived through while she was in Virginia. She made her way up to the summit of Mount Katahdin, and then she actually continued on past the summit and tackled a very difficult trail known as the Knife's Edge. It's kind of a staple in Baxter State Park, a staple on Mount Katahdin, and so she was able to get the full Katahdin experience. I really hope that by climbing Katahdin and standing at the northern terminus of the trail, she was able to get some closure, but from what I've read, it apparently made her kind of internalize just how much she had been, unjustly robbed of her Appalachian Trail through hike experience. And so because of this, she decided to give the Appalachian Trail another shot in 2020, though I wasn't able to find out if she ever actually did this, and I'm assuming that's because of the craziness that ensued in 2020. Not very many people through hiked that year, obviously because of COVID. And again, I'm just assuming this, but if that's the case, then that's just so terrible for her. She was robbed of her experience in 2019 in such a horrific way, and then she wasn't even able to hike in 2020. I mean, just absolutely terrible, to put it mildly. This female hiker was later quoted in an Outside Magazine article making a very important point that I want all of you to hear in the conclusion of this story. She said, quote, I am statistically more likely to die in a car crash than I am on the trail. It's just pretty bad luck, a complete fluke, that I got stabbed. And referring to her plans to hike the trail again in 2020, she said, quote, I wasn't scared the first time, and I won't be scared the second time. And even if I was scared, are you really gonna let a little fear stop you from what you want to do in life? In my opinion, she's absolutely right. Every single year, millions and millions of people hike on the Appalachian Trail. I've said this before, it's far safer to be on the AT than it is to walk down any city street, which is something that we all do without even thinking twice about it. I really, really hope that you can admire this hiker's resilience, and I hope that you can believe her when she still advocates for people to hike the AT. Please show some love to her and to Ronald Sanchez Jr. in the comment section. It always warms my heart, guys, when I see how supportive you all are to the victims that I talk about in this story. So please show them some love, and I still have one more thing that I want to tell you about. So at the very beginning of this video, I mentioned that I had a specific reason for finally covering this story. This is going to be a little bit clunky to explain, but essentially, this is unfortunately one of the most well-known stories from the Appalachian Trail in recent history, and it's for that reason that I thought covering this story would be a good opportunity for a give back call out related to the Appalachian Trail and related to the communities that surround it. As I'm sure all of you know by now, Hurricane Helene absolutely devastated the mountains in the southeast, and this includes the areas that the Appalachian Trail runs through. And so I want to do something to help, even if it's, just a little bit. I want to call out two organizations and ask you to join me in supporting them. The first organization is the Sawyer Foundation, who's helping to bring clean water to communities affected by Helene. Now, I've partnered with Sawyer in the past. I know a few of their employees personally, and I trust them completely, and so please consider making a donation to them. They're helping to get water filters to these areas that don't have clean water now. And the second organization that I want to mention here is a bit more specific to the Appalachian Trail. This is the ALDHA Care Emergency Relief Fund. They're taking donations to support hostels and trail providers who are in the greatest need right now. I hope that you'll join me in supporting these organizations, and I'll have both of them linked in the description. My heart goes out to anyone that was affected by Hurricane Helene. And of course, my heart goes out to the female hiker I talked about in this video, and to Ronald Sanchez Jr. and both of their friends and family for that matter. Such a sad story, and I appreciate all of you tuning in and watching me tell it. On an October day in 2010, experienced hiker and volunteer rescuer Pam Bales began climbing Mount Washington in New Hampshire. She thought this would be just a routine solo hike, which is something that she had done countless times before, even on this very mountain. But as the skies darkened and the temperatures plummeted, the mountain transformed into a deadly battleground of snow, wind, and freezing cold. But as brutal as the weather was in this moment, it would soon become literally the least of Pam's concerns. While she was battling through these near whiteout conditions, something caught Pam's eye. She noticed footprints in the snow, and these tracks led her off of her planned route and straight into a mystery that she could not ignore. It would turn out that Pam wasn't alone on the mountain that day. Somebody else had wandered into that very same storm, and by the time Pam found him, he was mere inches away from death. Pam quickly realized that this was not going to be an ordinary rescue. This man that she found wouldn't tell her his name, he barely spoke to her, and he refused to look her in the eye. The storm raged on, and every decision that Pam made meant the difference between life and death, as she literally risked everything to try to save this anonymous and evasive stranger. Pam would make it off the mountain that day, but reaching the safety and the warmth of her car did not mark the conclusion to this story. In fact, at that point, it was just getting started. She was left completely and utterly baffled about what had just happened. She wondered about who this man was that she had just encountered. She wondered about why he went up the mountain that day so dangerously unprepared. And perhaps the most puzzling question that she couldn't shake from her head was, why had he barely spoken to her as she guided him to safety? Why wouldn't he tell her his name? What the hell was he hiding? Pam pondered these unanswered questions during the days that followed, but then she got an anonymous letter in the mail, and as she read it, its contents revealed a chilling secret that changed everything Pam thought she knew about that fateful day on Mount Washington. And so without further ado, this is the unbelievable story of Pam Bales. When your average person thinks of dangerous mountains, New Hampshire's Mount Washington probably isn't on the list. I mean, maybe it is if you're a Northeast hiker like myself, but I don't know. Mountains like Everest or K2, I mean, these high Himalayan mountains are usually what come to mind. And I'm not saying that Mount Washington is as inherently dangerous as these peaks, but you might be surprised to know that despite only being 6,000 feet tall, just over, Mount Washington has proven time and time again that it's a killer. Again, if you're from the Northeast, you probably know this, but if you're not from the Northeast, you'll probably be surprised to hear that more than 160 people have died on Mount Washington, which makes it by far the most deadly mountain on the east coast of the US, and honestly, it makes it one of the deadliest mountains in the entire country. Its notorious reputation stems from its treacherous and unpredictable weather, especially during the winter and the unforgiving shoulder seasons. But at the same time, its accessibility also plays a role. I mean, this mountain is so close to Boston, to New York City, and just about every urban area in the northeastern United States. And so because of this, tons of people, myself included, hike Mount Washington. But most of those people hike it during the summer. By the time October starts to bring the onset of winter weather, the traffic, the numbers of people that are going up the mountain start to die down, and only the true hardos, as I call them, find themselves climbing the deadly peak. And one of those hardos that can take on Mount Washington any time of the year is Pam Bales. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to Mount Washington. Now this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. All right, here we go. Ready? In October of 2010, Pam Bales started up the Jewel Trail, planning to complete a solo loop hike, which included tagging the summit of Mount Washington. Now, Pam was no ordinary hiker. She was a seasoned outdoors woman, and she was also a nurse, which, by the way, is a combination that made her an ideal member of the Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue Team, where she had volunteered for over 5 years. Pam had ventured into New Hampshire's White Mountains countless times in order to save the lives of others. But on this day, the hike was meant for herself. It was a personal journey, some time to unwind, and yet, unbeknownst to her, within just a few short hours, her peaceful solo trek would transform into a desperate struggle for survival, both her survival and that of a complete and total stranger. Now, Pam Bales took safety very seriously. I mean, how couldn't she, given her experience working search and rescue? She had all the proper equipment for this cold shoulder season hike. She had scribbled down her plans and left the paper visible in her car just in case someone needed to come find her. And of course, she did what every responsible hiker should do before they set out. She checked the weather forecast before she started up the mountain. Now, this forecast called for wind chill temperatures around 0 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 18 degrees Celsius. And the forecast also called for wind speeds of up to 80 miles per hour. And so clearly this forecast was not ideal, but it was also the kind of weather that a prepared, seasoned hiker could deal with. Pam had hiked this route countless times before. She knew that she could do it. She knew the areas that weren't that exposed. And she also knew that if the weather made a turn for the worst, well, then she had multiple bailout points, trails that, of course, she had also done countless times before. In this type of weather, someone like Pam Bales would be just fine. However, for anyone less prepared, we'll say, this brutal weather could quickly become a death sentence, sealing their fate as Mount Washington's next unsuspecting victim. So Pam Bales sets off up Mount Washington, and as she climbed higher and higher, she periodically stopped to take some selfies. In the progression of photos, you can see that she's adding more and more layers in order to compensate for the weather, which was rapidly deteriorating. Eventually, she had to even reach for her snow goggles, and by the time that she did this, the wind had become absolutely fierce, whipping snow into a blinding swirl all around her. She was only a few miles into her hike before she began to weigh her options. Pushing for the summit, well, that was starting to feel like a gamble with death. Less than 1,000 vertical feet remained, but Pam, no stranger to life or death situations once again because of her search and rescue work, well, Pam knew how easily things could spiral out of control and how quickly. As she contemplated this decision, she took one more selfie, and then she noticed something that caused her heart to sink. Pam had been following a series of footsteps in the snow as she climbed up the Jewel Trail, but in this moment, she realized that something about these footprints was different. Something was off. These footprints didn't belong to the sturdy winter hiking boots that she expected. They were instead the unmistakable mark of sneakers, tennis shoes, the typical thing you just wear to the gym or to the mall or whatever. As soon as she noticed this, Pam knew that whoever she had been following was likely in deep trouble, because venturing into such treacherous terrain in sneakers, especially with how bad the conditions were, well, that was nothing short of reckless. So in this moment, Pam could have just turned around. The weather had gotten so bad, and after all, she was only responsible for herself. She could have turned around, she could have, just kind of shook her head at this anonymous person who made such a dangerous choice in footwear, and she could have just returned back to her car. However, that's not who Pam Bales is. I mean, she knew deep within her gut that something was wrong, and so instead of turning back to safety, she continued on through the biting wind and bitter cold, and she followed these footprints. And it wasn't long before Pam noticed the prints veering sharply off of the trail, heading directly into the treacherous expanse of the Great Gulf. The Great Gulf is a very unforgiving area on Mount Washington, and it's not the kind of place you want to just be wandering into off trail in the middle of a storm like this. And so when she noticed the footprints heading in that direction, she just got very, very anxious, and she really had to just pause and contemplate what her next move would be. It was evident to her that the person behind those tracks was struggling to navigate the harsh conditions and would likely perish in the freezing cold if Pam did not find them soon. And yet, at the same time, she understood that her own safety had to come first. And the deeper that she ventured into this perilous landscape off trail, the greater the chance that she would also find herself in a life or death situation. She's contemplating all these things, but ultimately she knew what she was going to do. Pam was not about to give up, and so she cautiously moved off of the trail, following the footprints while shouting out and blowing her whistle. Nobody replied to her screaming, but it didn't take long until she stumbled upon the origin of those footprints, a discovery that had swiftly transformed her solo hike into a rescue mission. Pam walked up to a man who was sitting eerily still against a boulder, covered in ice, a man who was clearly freezing to death. And just as she had suspected, given the footprints, this man was wearing sneakers. And by the way, the rest of his outfit was just as inappropriate for Mount Washington's dangerous weather. This man reportedly had on a light jacket, not some winter parka, just a light jacket. He apparently had on shorts, and he also had on gloves that were so thin and basically useless, so thin that he might as well have not been wearing them at all. And yet, despite his poor clothing choices, this man was still alive, at least for the moment. Seeing this sight unfolding in front of her, Pam knew that she had to act fast, and so she began her rescue mission with a simple yet determined hello. She greeted the man, and she noticed his eyes kind of flickering towards her, which revealed that he was in fact conscious and he was aware of her presence. But at the same time, when she greeted him, he stubbornly remained silent. He didn't say anything, which was very strange. But regardless of that, Pam quickly helped him into some extra warm clothing that she had brought along. Again, she was very prepared herself, took safety very seriously. And then she began assessing him for injuries. It seemed like he wasn't actually injured, he was just freezing to death. And so she continued to help him, and she also continued trying to engage him in conversation, asking if he even knew where he was. And when she asked him this, the question just kind of hung in the cold air and was met with silence, just like her first question had been. Undeterred, she followed up with yet another question. Pam asked the man, quote, "What is your name?" And once again, there was no response to this. So this man is just refusing to talk, refusing to share his name. But again, this didn't deter Pam. She actually decided to just completely take matters into her own hands. And so she gave this anonymous man the name John. Pam worked for nearly an hour to get John warm and stable enough so that he could return to his feet and begin hiking down the mountain. She gave him some hot chocolate that she had stored in her thermos. She covered her body in those hand warmer packets that a lot of people take skiing and stuff. And she also gave the man some electrolytes. After all of this effort, the man did eventually start to speak, and he offered a very confusing explanation for why he had ended up in this predicament. It didn't really make sense to Pam, but at least he was talking a little bit. But one thing that he still refused to do was to give Pam his name. While his evasiveness was both confusing and probably a little bit unsettling, to be frank, Pam didn't have the luxury of pondering the strangeness of this situation. That would have to wait. She understood that if this man didn't start moving soon, his chances of survival would plummet. And so with determination, she got him to his feet, and she basically forced him to descend the mountain by her side. And just in case you had forgotten, by this point, the conditions on Mount Washington had deteriorated so badly, even worse than they were when she first found him. I mean, it was to the point where Pam could barely make out the footprints that she had left in the snow just an hour earlier. It was that whiteout. It was just absolutely brutal. And so the two of them trudged forward, moving slowly, moving cautiously. But then all of a sudden, John just collapsed onto the ground. And by the way, at this point, they hadn't really made it very far. They'd only traveled about a half mile from the site where Pam initially found him. John collapsed, and then he curled up into a ball, essentially giving up on continuing on, and thus by extension, essentially giving up on his own life. Uncharacteristically, in this moment, he actually spoke to Pam, and the words that left his mouth were not encouraging. He told Pam that he was too tired to go on, and that he had just given up, and that she should just continue down the mountain without him. When Pam heard this, folks, she was having none of it. With fierce determination, she essentially told John to suck it up, Buttercup, and after a bit of coaxing, she managed to get him back on his feet. Now, the descent down the mountain was extremely difficult for Pam. Not only was she navigating treacherous terrain in harsh conditions, but she was also haunted by this fear that John might collapse again at any moment and refuse a lot more strongly to go on. His erratic behavior was really puzzling to her. When she first found him, I mean, he was clearly in early stages of hypothermia, which is a condition that often leads to irrational actions. So that can kind of explain it, but at the same time, Pam, through her search and rescue work, had encountered people suffering from hypothermia before, and something about John just felt different. Pam really couldn't put her finger on it. But despite that, she continued to push John down the mountain, trying to encourage him in any way that she could possibly think of. I mean, at one point, in an effort to kind of lift his spirits, she even found herself singing to him, just doing anything at all to try to lighten this heavy burden that they were both bearing at the moment. The pair hiked on, the sun set, it's now pitch black, and by headlamp, they finally reached the trailhead where their vehicles were parked a full 6 hours after Pam had managed to get John onto his feet. Miraculously, both of them were alive. They were both safe, albeit a bit shaken, but John hadn't left any dry clothing to change into in his vehicle, and thus Pam didn't quit quite yet. She turned on her car and she began warming his clothing so that he could drive home in comfort, and she also used this moment as an opportunity to figure out what the hell had just happened. She once again tried to engage John in conversation. She asked him why he had set out into the bad weather so unprepared, with the bad shoes and clothing and stuff. She asked him what his original plan was, like what was he thinking? Those are my words, not hers. And she also asked him what he would have done if she hadn't been there to rescue him. And after she asked him all these questions, John predictably had no response. Pam warmed his clothing for a few minutes, and then she returned them to him. John thanked her at this point. He started his car, and then he drove away into the night. The entire time up to and including this moment, he refused to give his name, and he refused to say anything at all that would identify him. Pam stood frozen as she watched John's taillights fade into the darkness, trying to grapple with the surreal reality of what had just happened. I mean, this was unlike any rescue mission that she had ever experienced before. John, he had expressed gratitude, and yet he remained so evasive, so bizarre. It was just weird. In fact, that word weird is probably an understatement, because this entire situation was just downright unsettling. After he drove away, Pam was left with an avalanche of questions crashing over her, drowning out any sense of resolution. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Pam managed to gather her thoughts enough to drive home. As she navigated the twisting roads of the White Mountains, her mind raced with how she would tell this story to her teammates at Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue. I mean, of course they would want to know about this. It's what they do. And she knew that they would be probably just as confused as she was, maybe even more so. But she also knew that possibly there was a chance that they could shed some light on the situation and offer some sort of explanation that Pam herself wasn't thinking of. Pam Bales spent the following days discussing the strange rescue with her search and rescue teammates, hoping to uncover this explanation, but as expected, no answers surfaced. John remained as much a mystery to them as he was to Pam. But then, exactly 1 week after that harrowing ordeal, a letter arrived at Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue addressed to the organization's president. This letter would soon become the most astonishing correspondence in the organization's history. Straight up. This letter revealed everything. It explained why John had ventured into the wilderness so dangerously unprepared. It explained why his behavior had been so, again, unsettling. And it explained why he refused to give his name to the very woman who had undeniably saved his life. The truth behind John's silence on the mountain that day was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Now, I usually don't read really long quotes in my videos, but I think I would be remiss if I left any of the details of this letter out. And so I'm going to read the entire thing to you guys, word for word. Now, this letter was sent along with a small donation to Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue, and here's what it said. I hope this reaches the right group of rescuers. This is hard to do, but must try, part of my therapy. I want to remain anonymous, but I was called John. On Sunday, October 17th, I went up my favorite trail, Jewel, to end my life. Weather was to be bad. Thought no one else would be there. I was dressed to go quickly. Next thing I knew, this lady was talking to me, changing my clothes, talking to me, giving me food, talking to me, making me warmer, and she just kept talking and calling me John and I let her. Finally learned her name was Pam. Conditions were horrible, and I said to leave me and get going, but she wouldn't. Got me up and had me stay right behind her, still talking. I followed, but I did think about running off. She couldn't see me. But I wanted to only take my life, not anybody else, and I think she would have tried to find me. The entire time, she treated me with care, compassion, authority, confidence, and the impression that I mattered. With all that has been going wrong in my life, I didn't matter to me, but I did to Pam. She probably thought I was the stupidest hiker dressed like I was, but I was never put down in any way. Chewed out, yes, in a kind way. Maybe I wasn't meant to die yet. I somehow still mattered in life. I became very embarrassed later on and never really thanked her properly. If she's an example of your organization/professionalism, you must be the best group around. Please accept this small offer of appreciation for her effort to save me way beyond the limits of safety. No did not seem in her mind. I am getting help with my mental needs. They will also help me find a job, and I have temporary housing. I have a new direction thanks to wonderful people like yourselves. I got your name from her pack patch and bumper sticker. My deepest thanks, John. All of a sudden, everything about that fateful day on the mountain, it just kind of fell into place for Pam. She had believed that she was merely saving a man from the cold grip of poor decisions, bad gear and bad planning. But in truth, she was rescuing him from far darker, far more dangerous demons. In what was perhaps the worst, most desperate moment of John's life, Pam emerged like a beacon in the storm. She didn't just pull him from the freezing wilderness. She reminded him, through her actions, that he mattered. John's letter revealed that this encounter, these fleeting moments of human connection, had ignited something profound within him. It was the spark that drove him to seek help, the first step towards reclaiming a life that had seemed lost in the shadow of despair. To this day, the identity of this John man, well, it remains a mystery. He never stepped forward. He never reached out to Pam again, at least that we know of. And maybe that's just the way that it was meant to be. What truly matters is not whether their paths crossed again, but that both Pam and John made it off the mountain that day, which is something that I encourage all of you to celebrate in the comments section right now. Pam's extraordinary rescue would later inspire a movie, the 2022 drama called Infinite Storm, with Naomi Watts bringing Pam's bravery to life on screen and Billy Howell embodying the troubled soul of John, which I think is pretty cool. They made a movie out of this. Definitely gave Pam some more recognition, which she absolutely deserved. But at the same time, despite all of the attention and the praise, it seems to me that Pam Bales has kept a pretty low profile since the rescue and also since the release of this film. She's done a couple interviews, a couple articles and stuff, but for the most part, she's really kind of just stayed out of the spotlight. And I think that speaks to her character, because this entire situation, her actions on the mountain that day, were obviously never about anything else other than saving this stranger in front of her. She was simply just doing what she thought was right. Now, you'll recall that John didn't just send that letter to Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue. He also left a small donation to the group, which was very nice of him. And I've spent more time hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire than anywhere else in the world. I absolutely love the Whites so much. I want to have a cabin there or something someday. And with all that said, I can tell you firsthand, over the years that I've been hiking there, I've heard countless stories of Pemigewasset Valley Search and Rescue saving the lives of hikers. I was familiar with them long before I ever made this video or heard this story, and they're the obvious give back call out for this video. I've made a donation to them, and I encourage you to do the same, even if it's just a few dollars. I'll have their link in the description, and I'll tell you right now, if you're feeling generous, and especially if you live in New England, there is not a better cause that you can donate your money to. I would appreciate it so much. Hit that link, send them some money, show them some love, and just please join me in giving back to them. And speaking of showing love, show some love for Pam and for John in the comments section. Do it right now. I really hope that John was able to find some purpose in his life. And on that note, I also hope that any of you that have been struggling lately, well, I hope that you can find the same thing. In April of 2019, climber Austin Howell posted this jaw-dropping photo on Instagram. There he is, dangling off the edge of a massive cliff, one arm gripping the rock without any ropes, without any harnesses, literally nothing but the raw defiance of gravity. In the conclusion to the photo's caption, Austin wrote, quote, "I'm not going to die climbing. I'd be far too pissed off if my epitaph read, 'We told you so.'" This part of his caption would not age well at all. Austin Howell was not your typical climber. He faced sheer cliffs, exposed faces, and dizzying heights without a single rope or harness to break his fall. One wrong move, one loose rock, one unexpected gust of wind, and it would all be over in the blink of an eye. And for Austin, this wasn't really about thrill seeking. It was actually about something far deeper and far darker. With each ascent that he made, he took risks that most of us can't even comprehend. And for many people, this was simply viewed as reckless. But for Austin, risking his life on free solo climbs was actually part of the process of saving his life. And yet at the same time, the very thing that seemed to save his life would eventually lead him to an inevitable heart-stopping end shortly after this very photo was taken. But with that said, Austin Howell's story is far more than just a tragic finale. His life was a constant battle as he sought to liberate himself from the very demons that would end up indirectly claiming his life. And so without further ado, folks, this is the powerful and haunting story of a man who dared everything and ultimately lost it all. This is the story of Austin Howell. Now, folks, I am not a climber. I'm not even close, but I don't think you have to be a climber to appreciate the skills and, quite honestly, the guts of those who free solo climb. If you're not sure what that means, free soloing is a form of rock climbing where the climber ascends without any ropes, without any harnesses or any protective equipment. AKA, if you mess up or you slip and you fall, then you die. Many of you are probably familiar with Alex Honnold, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest climbers and free soloists of all time. Hell, you may have even seen the film Free Solo, which captures Honnold's relentless journey to become the first person to free solo climb the towering El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. This film is super popular. I watched it many years ago, and a little bit of a spoiler, Honnold survived that climb against unimaginable odds, by the way. But the brutal truth is that many other extremely skilled free soloists like Honnold who dared to chase similar heights, well, they have not been so lucky. I now need to introduce you to a beloved man named Austin Howell, a man who was not nearly as famous as Alex Honnold, and yet a man who still carved out a place for himself in Honnold's elite league of climbing skill. And so with that said, hit the subscribe button right now and help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, especially if you're a repeat viewer. And yeah, let's meet Austin. Austin Howell grew up in the Houston, Texas suburbs, and though I wasn't able to find very much information about his childhood, we do know one surprising thing for sure. Despite what he would later on become known for, Austin didn't grow up climbing. Sure, like most young boys, myself included, he did like climb around on trees and stuff when he was young, but it wasn't until he enrolled at the University of Houston that Austin finally found himself on a climbing wall for the first time. In 2006, Austin Howell entered his freshman year and he was studying electrical engineering, a major which is definitely no joke, very difficult. And yet despite this, it wasn't his lectures on math or physics that truly captivated his attention. Instead, it was the university's climbing gym. Austin Howell was hooked from the very first moment he grabbed a hold of that wall. This very first time, he apparently made it up about 15 feet, but then he found himself stuck, just kind of unsure of what to do next. I've only been to a climbing gym like 2 or 3 times, and I found myself in this very same situation every single time I went. And when this happened to me, I would get frustrated and flustered and just like confused about what my next move should be. But when Austin found himself in that situation, that wasn't what he did. He wasn't intimidated or frustrated. This challenging moment seemingly unlocked something within him. This wasn't just a wall that he was climbing. It was a puzzle that he needed to solve, and, well, he was very determined to make that happen. Folks, solve it he did. Austin became a regular at that climbing gym, returning over and over and over until eventually he earned his place among the university's top climbers. But then, just 2 years later, in 2008, an unexpected tragedy would strike in Austin's world. Austin Howell would end up facing a setback that was so severe that it threatened not only his climbing career, but his very life as he knew it. So one day in 2008, Austin was at the climbing gym, and he was nearly 35 feet up on the wall on what was supposed to be just a routine climb. And so he's up there and everything's going fine, and then all of a sudden, this happens sometimes, he lost his grip. And for most climbers, a fall from that height is hardly cause for fear. I mean, it's scary, but you have safety ropes and you have a belayer standing by ready to catch you as you fall. But this time, unfortunately, was very different. Still years away from the moment that Austin would begin free soloing, he now faced a moment that would be just as perilous. His belayer, distracted and inattentive, wasn't paying attention when Austin slipped. It was basically as if Austin had been free soloing all along. He plummeted 35 feet, crashing back first into the ground with brutal, violent force. The impact shattered 3 of his vertebrae, fractured multiple bones in both of his feet, and it caused just devastating trauma to Austin's brain. After this accident, he would spend 4 agonizing months in a back brace. But honestly, that was just the beginning. The journey to heal Austin's brain would be even more grueling, an injury that some people close to him say that he never fully recovered from. According to his father, Austin Howell's mental health took a dark turn after this accident. Temporarily losing climbing, his life passion, was only part of the story. The real pain was the toll that the injury took on his brain. In a haunting revelation, Austin himself actually disputed this, saying that depression and thoughts of suicide had been haunting him from a very young age. Climbing, he would later say, was the only thing that seemed to quiet those relentless demons. In the very same Instagram post that I shared at the start of this video, Austin wrote, quote, "The most terrifying moment I've ever had wasn't while soloing. It was a long time ago on top of a building while my mind fought to destroy me, as it had been doing since my earliest memories. Life is an inherently dangerous sport, and mine a bit more than others. If it wasn't for soloing, I might have been dead already. It seemed that rock climbing was Austin's only true escape, a battle against inner turmoil as much as it was against nature itself. But that thrill, that rush that comes with strapping in, or whatever climbers call it, and heading up the wall, well, eventually it just wasn't enough. As Austin's passion for climbing grew stronger and his skills grew sharper, he quickly developed a dangerous love for not just climbing, but for free soloing. Austin would defy the odds and go on to recover from his first brutal fall. And of course, he quickly returned to climbing, albeit against the wishes of his family. It was during his comeback from this fall that he found himself on his very first free solo climb, a risky endeavor that, ironically, wasn't really supposed to be part of the plan that day. Austin found himself climbing at Enchanted Rock in the hill country of Texas, and after easily tackling a route called Texas Crude, Austin made an impulsive decision. Without a second thought, he handed his friend a camera, saying that he was about to attempt the route again, but this time without any ropes, without a harness, and without pretty much any safety equipment other than his shoes. It would be just Austin and the rock that he was climbing. Now, he swore to his friend in this moment that this would be a one-time thing, a thrill that he would never chase again. But, predictably, that promise was broken almost immediately. Austin's first free solo climb went flawlessly, which sparked an unquenchable thirst for more. And so the very next weekend, well, Austin was back doing it again, pushing the limits even further. And it wasn't long after this that Austin just straight up dropped out of the University of Houston and stepped fully into the lifestyle of a classic dirtbag, which is like a badge of honor for those who live simply, traveling around in vans or trucks, chasing adventure after adventure across rugged landscapes. That's what I mean by dirtbag. I don't mean that as an insult. Austin was basically all in. He was embracing a life on the edge, one climb away from the freedom that he was searching for, but also potentially just one climb away from death. As Austin's climbing abilities grew, so did his resilience against the lifelong battles with depression and the mental health struggles that had shadowed him for so long. And yet, as his strength and his skills soared, so too did the risks that he was willing to take on the wall. And it almost pains me to say that, especially after pouring through his social media accounts in preparation for this video. Austin began sharing his free solo climbs for the internet to see, and his opinion was unapologetically clear. Free soloing wasn't just a thrill, it was a lifeline. To him, the mental peace that it provided was too often overshadowed by the dangers that other people saw in the sport, which was a judgment that he pushed back against with conviction. In one post, he wrote, quote, "Free soloing isn't a death wish, it's a life wish. It's the single best therapy I've ever found for calming my tumultuous mind. The control that I've developed on the wall transfers into my daily life. This is important because I'm not the guy who beat depression. I don't get to be that guy. I've got to manage this for my entire life. I'm not soloing for the other reason that many will toss either. A narcissistic craving for attention isn't driving this show because I don't get a bump off of praise like most people. Instead, it feels foul and false because my mind tells me it knows better." It's easy to view these videos of Austin Howell free soloing and just assume that he's this reckless dude making bad choices and putting himself at unnecessary risk. And yet, it's important to note that Austin took his safety as seriously as anyone who free solos possibly can. I really want to make that clear. I don't want to give the impression that he was just this reckless nut job. Austin trained intensely. He was always working to improve his strength. He would never set out on a free solo climb just blindly, right? He would research the route extensively beforehand, and he would also climb the route while attached via a harness before he ever soloed it, just to make sure that it was within his abilities. It was dangerous, obviously. Austin never shied away from that, but at the same time, if anyone had the skills, the training, and the mindset to do it, well, it was Austin. In 2015, a video of Austin Howell free soloing a route called Dopey Duck on North Carolina's Short Off Mountain went viral on the internet. This video captured him hundreds of feet above the ground without a shred of clothing on, completely butt naked, clinging to the rock face. The scene is equal parts hilarious and also heart-stopping, a moment that reveals both Austin's audacious climbing skills and his, we'll call it, mischievous spirit. In that famous video, Austin is truly in his element. But as fate would have it, we're actually going to be returning to this very same mountain and even the same route later in the video. And when we do this, it will be under circumstances that are just about the furthest possible thing from a laughing matter. Only about a month after Austin's infamous naked climb went viral, he set his sights on one of the most iconic challenges in climbing. That would be El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. The plan that day remains a bit unclear to me. I'm not sure if they were planning on free soloing or if they were just planning on normal climbing, but again, I don't know the correct terminology there, but regardless, apparently the conditions were pretty bad that day, and so Austin actually found himself aid climbing, like using some additional equipment and ladders rather than just normal free climbing. All that to say is that he was roped in. He had safety gear, even more gear than you would typically have, even if you were roped in. And this climb should have just been pretty routine, but unfortunately, it most certainly was not. And ultimately, Austin's climb that day would end in just straight up disaster. While climbing the legendary route known as the Nose, a piece of Austin's aid gear suddenly slipped. In an instant, Austin plummeted headfirst, crashing nearly 20 feet down the rock face with devastating results. This was the second major fall of his career, the first major fall since he had started free soloing, though he obviously wasn't on this particular day. And actually, that's a bit ironic that both of his really bad falls up to this point had happened while he was roped in and not free soloing. The impact of this fall was absolutely brutal, just like the first one. Austin suffered a broken skull, 5 broken vertebrae this time, a fractured shoulder blade, a broken wrist, and severe damage to his left eardrum, which left him permanently deaf in that ear. He spent over a week in a medically induced coma before he was finally released from the hospital. Though Austin miraculously survived this horrific accident, its implications on his ability to climb were very, very grim. Doctors told Austin that he would be lucky if he was even able to walk unaided ever again, let alone get back to climbing. This injury to his ear was a really, really big deal, far beyond just his ability to hear. I mean, it would affect his balance greatly. And because his balance was now compromised, the idea of steadying himself on a rock wall basically seemed impossible. In his doctor's eyes, Austin's climbing career was over. But unsurprisingly, Austin refused to give up. Despite his family's deep concerns after this second just brutal fall, he returned to the climbing gym, determined as ever to defy every single obstacle that would be thrown his way. Step by grueling step, Austin rebuilt his strength, pushing himself to master these balance issues that had threatened to keep him grounded forever. His skill and honestly his sheer willpower would end up prevailing, and it didn't take long before Austin was back in the wild, not even in the gym, back in the wild, free soloing once again, tackling climbs without ropes. And this time he was stronger and, quite frankly, fiercer than he ever had been before. And yet, despite making another tremendous physical comeback, Austin's mental health continued to suffer. He wrote about this pretty extensively on his Instagram, his Facebook, and his blog, his website. He actually even started a podcast, hoping that his story would inspire others who were struggling with depression, and of course, hoping that by being so candid about his free soloing journey, he would actually help vindicate the practice in the eyes of the public. And actually, on that note of public opinion, I'm willing to bet that there's going to be a lot of different opinions about free soloing in the comment section of this video. I have a slight hunch that those who are opposed to it might be the loudest, though I definitely could be wrong about that. I guess we'll find out. But regardless, free soloing is obviously quite controversial, and something that's probably even more controversial is posting about it and like posting videos of yourself doing it on social media. There's definitely people out there that thought that Austin thrived off of the attention that his videos got, and these people also felt that he was acting irresponsibly by promoting such a dangerous thing on the internet. But with that said, you can't forget that Austin himself actually refuted this idea in one of the quotes from him that I shared earlier. The truth is that we're never gonna know exactly how much of a role the views and the likes and the clicks played in Austin's free solo journey. I did read reports that a few times he would like free solo something, get back to his camera, and then realize that the video didn't record for whatever reason, and then he would set the camera up and then go do it again just so he could get it on camera. Now, that was just like some Reddit speculation, so I don't know if that's 100% true. I can't confirm that, but if it is, then it does suggest that sharing his climbs with the world was definitely a motivating factor for Austin. And yet, at the same time, I think it's pretty undeniable that free soloing just got Austin Howell stoked on life. And so make no mistake about it, I'm not trying to suggest that the only reason he did it was for internet clout or anything ridiculous like that. That's definitely not true. This dude was just badass and he loved to free solo. And I'm just trying to illustrate here that free soloing remains somewhat controversial to the general public, and in my opinion, it seems that Austin Howell's content was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it came to this. No pun intended. On one hand, Austin was extremely skilled, and he also advocated for free soloing in the safest possible manner, though obviously it's going to be dangerous no matter how you do it, but still. Austin very clearly acknowledged the risks of what he was doing. I mean, how couldn't you after all of the injuries that he had suffered? And he also, once again, used his platform to help and to connect with other people suffering from depression. Austin Howell, from everything I've been able to gather going back through posts and threads and all this stuff, it seems as though Austin Howell was absolutely beloved within the climbing community. He had a great reputation, and everyone who climbed with him or like met him out in the wild, and honestly most of the people that watched his content for that matter, respected the hell out of his skills and his attitude. And yet, no matter how inspirational Austin was, there was always going to be people out there who disapproved of what he was doing. But these people were not going to stop him. Hell, even his own family couldn't stop him. Austin was so passionate about free soloing that he apparently refused to speak with his mother for over a year after his second accident, simply because she wasn't supportive of his free soloing. And so with all that said, it appears that the only thing that would be able to stop Austin Howell from free soloing was the very act of free soloing itself. On June 30th, 2019, Austin went back to Short Off Mountain in North Carolina which again is the very same mountain that he had gone viral on for his naked climb years earlier. From what I've gathered, Austin had climbed at Short Off Mountain numerous times. This was an area that he was very familiar with, an area he was comfortable in, and an area that he had always returned from unharmed. But on this fateful day in June, that would unfortunately not be the case. Austin was not alone at the beginning of his climb that day. He was actually accompanied by a photographer named Ben Wu. Ben would climb beside Austin, and he snapped a bunch of photos of Austin that are guaranteed to leave your palms absolutely just dripping with sweat. These photos show Austin in his natural habitat. Once again, just in his element. He's wearing his classic tie-dye t-shirt. He's climbing up a steep wall hundreds of feet above the ground with no ropes and no harness. He looks happy. He's goofing around, and yet at the same time, you can tell that he's incredibly focused. He even stops to flip off the camera a few times, which is honestly pretty funny, and it's also pretty badass if you ask me. In fact, this photo right here is probably one of the most badass photos that I've ever seen. Austin is just hanging there by one arm. He's flipping off the camera. I mean, his shoelaces look like they're not even tied. I'm not sure what that's about. And of course, he's just got a giant smile on his face. In Austin's Instagram bio, he has a quote from Alex Lowe, which reads, "The best climber on earth is the one having the most fun." And if there's any truth at all in that quote, based on this series of photos, Austin Howell was the best climber on earth that day. However, the story behind these photographs gets incredibly dark when you learn what happened next. As fate would have it, the photos that you just saw, well, they would end up being the last photos of Austin Howell. So after taking all these pictures, photographer Ben Wu left the mountain, but Austin continued and just started climbing by himself. Sometime later, two other climbers were preparing to climb Dopey Duck when they spotted Austin free soloing near the very top of the route. I mean, he was almost up it. He was almost done. One of these climbers even recognized Austin from his Instagram. He recognized his classic tie-dye shirt. As these climbers watched in awe, Austin made a shift to the side. But then, in a heart-stopping instant, he slipped and he screamed out the word "no." This scream tore through the air before a haunting silence fell over the cliff. The onlookers could only stand frozen as Austin disappeared from view, his body plummeting down to the ground below. This was Austin's third major climbing accident, and tragically, it would be his last. Death reached the headlines. There was an incredible outpouring of grief and love directed towards him. Again, I scrolled through like all of his social media in preparation for this video, and I noticed that even 5 years after that last fall, there's still people leaving comments on his content, memorializing him and paying their respects to him to this day. And regardless of what you think about free soloing, I'd like to encourage you to take this opportunity to echo those very same sentiments in the comment section of this video right now. I also want to encourage you to drop the names or links of any mental health charities that you trust in the comments below. Depression was obviously a huge part of Austin's story, and it would mean the world to me if we could all come together here with positivity and just make the comment section that. I should just leave it there. I want to hear your guys' thoughts about Austin's story and about free soloing as well. And please be sure to be respectful in the comments. If your language is too colorful, then YouTube is just going to automatically delete your comment. And if I see anything that's just like blatantly disrespectful, I don't delete a lot of comments, but if I see that directed towards, you know, a victim in our story, I'm going to delete that. Obviously, Austin Howell made some very risky choices in the outdoors and in his life, and ultimately he paid the price for it. But with that said, I want you to remember that free soloing also gave Austin life. I'm going to close out this story by repeating this quote from Austin's Instagram. "Life is an inherently dangerous sport, mine a bit more than others. If it wasn't for soloing, I might have been dead already."